Hello friends. Did you know nearly 80% of those who watch my videos aren't subscribed? If you enjoy these stories, please hit that subscribe button and leave a like. It really helps. Thank you for being here. By the way, where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. Wyatt Sullivan had been driving long haul for 14 years when he first saw the man on Interstate 70. It was October 15, 2019, around 2:47 a.m. according to his dashboard clock, and Wyatt was hauling computer equipment from Kansas to Colorado through one of the loneliest stretches of highway in America. The load was routine, the weather was clear, and he was making good time toward his Denver delivery when the headlights of his red Peterbilt swept across a figure standing on the shoulder near the Kansas-Colorado border. The man stood perfectly still, wearing a faded gray jacket that looked like it had seen better decades, and carrying a small duffel bag that hung from his left hand like it weighed nothing at all. He wasn't thumbing for a ride like most hitchhikers Wyatt had encountered over the years. He wasn't even facing the direction of traffic. Instead, he was positioned at an angle that allowed him to observe approaching vehicles while remaining slightly withdrawn from the highway's edge, as if he was evaluating each truck that passed, rather than simply hoping for transportation. Something about his posture, the way he held himself perfectly motionless against the prairie wind that was strong enough to rock an 18-wheeler, made Wyatt's hands tighten involuntarily on the steering wheel. In 14 years of professional driving, Wyatt had developed instincts about people and situations that didn't quite feel right. This man triggered every one of those warning signals. Wyatt had picked up plenty of hitchhikers over the years. It was part of the unwritten code of the road that truckers followed, an understanding that drivers looked out for each other and for stranded travelers, especially in remote areas where a broken-down car or running out of gas could mean the difference between inconvenience and genuine danger. The highways of America could be unforgiving places, particularly during winter months, or in desert regions where help might be hundreds of miles away. But something about this particular hitchhiker made Wyatt hesitate. Maybe it was the way the man didn't wave or signal for help, didn't display any of the usual body language that indicated someone in need of assistance. Maybe it was how he seemed to know exactly when Wyatt's truck would pass that specific spot, standing ready and waiting like he'd been expecting this particular encounter at this precise time. Most unsettling was the man's face, which Wyatt could see clearly in his headlights as he approached. Middle-aged, probably somewhere in his 50s, with graying hair and weathered skin that spoke of years spent outdoors. But his eyes were what caught Wyatt's attention and held it. Pale blue and completely emotionless, they seemed to look right through Wyatt's windshield and directly into his thoughts rather than simply observing his truck. At the last possible second, Wyatt pressed the accelerator instead of the brake pedal. His truck rumbled past the hitchhiker at 75 miles per hour, and when he checked his side mirrors, the man was gone. Not walking away, not visible in the distance, just completely vanished from the empty highway behind him as if he'd never been there at all. Wyatt shook his head and reached for his thermos of coffee, telling himself that what he'd experienced was highway hypnosis, that dangerous state of altered consciousness that every trucker knew about but hoped never to experience. The mind played tricks when you'd been staring at white lines and yellow markers for too many hours, especially during the dead-of-night runs when the brain's natural circadian rhythms were fighting against the need to stay alert and focused. He'd probably imagined the whole encounter, or maybe seen a mailbox or road sign that his tired brain had interpreted as a human figure. It happened to drivers all the time, particularly on routes like this one where the landscape was so monotonous that the mind began creating its own entertainment just to stay occupied. But even as Wyatt tried to rationalize what he'd seen, he couldn't shake the memory of those pale blue eyes that had seemed to catalog every detail of his appearance, his truck, and his route. The hitchhiker had looked at him with the kind of focused attention that suggested recognition rather than casual observation, as if he'd been specifically waiting for Wyatt's truck rather than hoping for any available ride. The feeling of being watched and evaluated stayed with Wyatt for the remaining hours of his drive to Denver. Every shadow on the roadside made him look twice. Every reflection in his mirrors caused a moment of tension, and every other vehicle on the highway seemed potentially suspicious. By the time he reached his delivery point, Wyatt was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the physical demands of driving and everything to do with psychological stress he couldn't quite identify or explain. 2 weeks later, on November 3rd, Wyatt was running the same route in reverse, carrying auto parts from Denver back to Kansas City. The delivery in Colorado had gone smoothly, and he was making excellent time on Interstate 70 eastbound, already calculating that he'd reach his destination several hours ahead of schedule. The early arrival would give him time to rest properly before his next assignment, maybe even catch up on some maintenance issues that his truck had been developing. It was around 1:30 a.m. when he saw the hitchhiker again. Same man, same gray jacket, same small duffel bag hanging from his left hand. This time he was standing on the Colorado side of the border, approximately 50 miles east of where Wyatt had encountered him 2 weeks earlier. But everything else was identical. The motionless posture, the emotionless expression, and those pale blue eyes that seemed to recognize Wyatt's truck from a distance that should have made individual identification impossible. Wyatt hit his air brakes hard enough to activate the automatic warning systems, bringing his 18-wheeler to a stop on the highway shoulder about 20 feet past the hitchhiker's position. His heart was pounding as he set the parking brake and rolled down his passenger side window, trying to convince himself that this was just a coincidence, that plenty of people hitchhiked along major interstate routes. "You need a lift, partner," Wyatt called out, his voice carrying clearly in the still desert air. The hitchhiker turned and walked toward the truck with steps that were oddly measured and precise, like someone following choreography rather than moving naturally. When he got close enough for conversation, Wyatt could see his face clearly under the truck's exterior lighting. The man appeared to be in his mid-50s, with gray hair that looked like it was cut with professional precision rather than the rough, uneven style that might be expected from someone living on the road. His clothes, while obviously worn, were clean and well-maintained. The gray jacket showed signs of extensive use but no obvious damage or staining. His boots were sturdy and practical, the kind that would serve well for long-distance walking, but they weren't worn down or damaged in the way that would be expected from someone who'd been hitchhiking for any significant period of time. "Denver," the man said when he reached the truck. His voice was flat and emotionless, completely lacking the inflection or enthusiasm that Wyatt would have expected from someone who'd been waiting on a highway shoulder for transportation. "Sorry, friend. I'm heading east toward Kansas. That's the wrong direction for you if you're trying to reach Denver." The hitchhiker nodded once, a movement that was as mechanical and precise as his walking had been. He didn't argue, didn't ask about alternative transportation options, didn't show any of the disappointment or frustration that Wyatt would have expected from someone whose travel plans had been disrupted. Instead, the man simply turned and walked away from the truck without another word, disappearing into the darkness beyond Wyatt's headlights with the same abrupt completeness that had characterized his previous vanishing act. The encounter left Wyatt deeply unsettled. He'd offered rides to thousands of people over his 14-year career, and their reactions were always predictable within a normal range of human emotions. Disappointment when he couldn't provide the help they needed, gratitude when he could, sometimes anger or desperation when they were facing particularly difficult circumstances. But this hitchhiker had shown no emotion at all. He'd accepted Wyatt's inability to help with the same expressionless calm that he might have shown to a weather report or traffic announcement. Most people would have asked follow-up questions, inquired about other drivers who might be heading in the right direction, or at least expressed some acknowledgement of the inconvenience. This man had simply walked away as if the interaction had proceeded exactly according to some predetermined script that he was following. 3 hours later, at a truck stop near Goodland, Kansas, Wyatt decided to use his CB radio to ask other drivers about their experiences with hitchhikers along the I-70 corridor. He keyed his microphone to channel 19, the frequency that most truckers monitored for informal communication and traffic information. Anyone running eastbound or westbound on 70 through Colorado tonight? Looking for information about a hitchhiker some of you might have seen. After several seconds of static, a gravelly voice responded with the distinctive cadence of a veteran driver who'd been on the road for decades. This is Big Dog in the blue Freightliner, currently eastbound about 30 miles behind you. What kind of hitchhiker are you asking about? Middle-aged guy, maybe 55 or so, wearing a gray jacket and carrying a small duffel bag. Seen him twice now in the last couple of weeks, both times near the Kansas-Colorado border area. Something about him doesn't seem quite right. There was a long pause before Big Dog responded, and when he did, his voice carried a tone that Wyatt hadn't expected. You mean the ghost? Wyatt's coffee cup stopped halfway to his lips. Come again on that, Big Dog? That hitchhiker you're describing, he's been spotted all over the I-70 corridor for about 3 years now. Different truckers see him at different times and locations, but always the same description. Gray jacket, small bag, stands in that weird way where he doesn't seem to actually want to ride. Another voice joined the conversation, this one belonging to a driver who identified himself as Road Warrior. I seen that same individual last month near Junction, Colorado. Exactly like you described. Asked him where he was going and he said Denver, but when I told him I was heading to Salt Lake City and could take him partway west, he just walked away without saying anything else. Same experience here, transmitted a third driver. Saw him twice this summer, both times near the Colorado border area. Never accepts rides, just stands there and watches trucks go by like he's studying something. Wyatt grabbed a pen and his logbook to take notes. How many of you have actually seen this guy? Over the next 25 minutes, 8 different truckers reported encounters with what appeared to be the same hitchhiker. The descriptions were identical in every significant detail. Gray jacket that looked old but well-maintained, small duffel bag, pale blue eyes, emotionless expression, and the peculiar habit of asking for rides to specific destinations but never actually accepting transportation when it was offered. But the geographic range of the sightings was what made the situation genuinely disturbing. The hitchhiker had been reported not just on I-70 through Kansas and Colorado, but also on I-80 through Wyoming and Utah, I-40 through New Mexico and Arizona, and even I-25 through Colorado and New Mexico. The distances involved would require constant travel at speeds that would be impossible for someone depending on hitchhiked rides. Maybe he's got his own transportation, suggested one trucker. Could be he's working some kind of scam, setting up at different spots to test how truckers react to certain situations. What kind of scam? Big Dog asked. Every driver who's talked to him says the same thing. He asks for a ride, you offer help or explain why you can't help, and he just walks away. No money requests, no sob story, no attempt to get into anyone's truck. Road Warrior offered a different theory that made Wyatt's blood run cold. I heard something from my dispatcher about a month ago. Apparently there's been a pattern of trucker disappearances along these same routes. Solo drivers who just vanish without any explanation. Trucks found abandoned at rest stops or truck stops, but the drivers are never located. How many disappearances? Wyatt asked. I don't know exact numbers, but enough that some companies are starting to require buddy system driving for certain routes. 2 drivers per truck or convoy travel with regular check-ins. The conversation continued for another hour, with more truckers joining in to share their own stories and observations. The pattern that emerged painted a picture of something far more complex and troubling than a simple highway oddity. The mysterious hitchhiker appeared to be conducting some form of systematic observation of trucking operations along major interstate routes throughout the western United States. He always wore identical clothing, carried the same bag, and behaved in the same mechanical way that suggested either extensive training or some form of psychological conditioning. Most disturbing was the timing correlation between hitchhiker sightings and trucker disappearances. While not every driver who reported seeing the gray-jacketed man had subsequently vanished, every disappearance had occurred on routes where the hitchhiker had been spotted by other drivers within the previous few weeks. "I think he's marking targets," transmitted a trucker who identified himself as Mountain Mike. "Studying our patterns, learning our routes, maybe reporting back to someone else about which trucks to follow or which drivers to approach under different circumstances." "But what would be the point?" Big Dog asked. "Truckers don't carry large amounts of cash, and our cargo is usually insured and tracked. Truck hijacking is a federal crime with serious penalties, and the profit margins wouldn't justify the risks." Mountain Mike had an answer that made everyone on the channel go quiet. "Maybe it's not about the money or the cargo. Maybe someone's collecting truckers themselves." After signing off from the CB conversation, Wyatt drove the rest of the way to Kansas City with a growing sense of unease that had nothing to do with road conditions or mechanical concerns. Every vehicle that appeared in his mirrors seemed potentially suspicious. Every rest stop looked like a place where someone might be waiting to approach unwary drivers, and every mile marker reminded him that he was traveling alone on highways that stretched for thousands of miles through sparsely populated regions. The next morning, after completing his delivery and getting some rest at a motel near the shipping terminal, Wyatt used the computer in the truck stop's driver's lounge to research missing person reports and unsolved disappearances involving truck drivers in the western states. What he found confirmed his worst fears about the scope and seriousness of the situation. Over the past 3 years, 47 professional truck drivers had vanished while traveling solo routes through Kansas, Colorado, Wyoming, Utah, Nevada, New Mexico, and Arizona. Their trucks had been located at various rest stops, truck stops, and highway pull-offs, but the drivers themselves had simply disappeared without any trace of where they had gone or what had happened to them. The missing truckers were all experienced professionals with clean driving records, good safety ratings, and no history of the kind of personal or financial problems that might motivate someone to abandon their vehicle and disappear voluntarily. They had been driving different routes, hauling various types of cargo, and working for different companies, but they shared certain characteristics that formed a disturbing pattern. All of the disappeared drivers had been traveling alone. All of them had been found to have made their last position reports or communication contacts within normal parameters, showing no signs of distress or unusual circumstances. And all of them had vanished from locations that were isolated enough to prevent immediate discovery of their abandoned vehicles, but accessible enough to suggest that the drivers had stopped voluntarily rather than being forced off the road. Most chilling was the timeline. The first disappearance had been reported on November 18, 2016, just 3 weeks before the earliest documented sighting of the mysterious hitchhiker that truckers had begun calling the Ghost. But what truly convinced Wyatt that he was dealing with something far more serious than coincidence was a detail buried in one of the police reports he found online. Marcus Thompson, a driver who had vanished near Grand Junction, Colorado, in March of 2018, had called his dispatcher just 2 hours before his truck was found abandoned. During that conversation, he had mentioned seeing the same weird hitchhiker I've been spotting for the past month, always wearing that gray jacket and never actually getting in anyone's truck. The hitchhiker wasn't just appearing at random locations. He was stalking specific drivers over extended periods of time, learning their routes and schedules before making whatever move resulted in their disappearance. Wyatt printed out copies of the missing person reports and spent the afternoon reading through them while sitting in his truck in the parking lot of the Kansas City shipping terminal. Each case told essentially the same story. An experienced professional driver traveling a familiar route simply vanished, leaving behind a truck full of cargo and personal belongings, but no clue about where they had gone or what had happened to them. Jake Williams, age 34, disappeared from a rest stop near Lyman, Colorado. His truck was found with the engine still running, driver's door open, personal effects undisturbed. No witnesses, no security camera coverage, no indication of struggle or foul play. Sandra Martinez, age 41, vanished from a truck stop near Green River, Utah. Surveillance cameras showed her parking her rig and walking toward the main building, but she never appeared in any interior footage and was never seen leaving the facility. Her truck sat in the parking lot for 3 days before anyone realized she was missing. Tommy Chen, age 52, disappeared from a highway pull-off near Flagstaff, Arizona. His truck was discovered by a highway patrol officer conducting routine checks of commercial vehicles. The engine was off, keys were in the ignition, and Chen's logbook showed that he had been on schedule and making normal progress toward his destination just hours before he vanished. Each case was being investigated by local law enforcement agencies. But the jurisdictional complications of crimes that crossed multiple state boundaries meant that no single agency had developed a comprehensive understanding of the pattern. The FBI had been notified about several of the disappearances, but federal resources were limited and the cases didn't meet the criteria for immediate priority attention. As Wyatt read through the reports, he began to understand that he and his fellow truckers were facing a predator who understood their industry well enough to exploit its vulnerabilities. The killer, or killers, knew how truckers thought, where they stopped when they were most vulnerable, and how to approach them without triggering suspicion. That evening, as Wyatt prepared for his next assignment, his cell phone rang with a call from his dispatcher. Sharon had been working the same desk for 8 years, and Wyatt trusted her judgment about routes, customers, and industry conditions. "We lost another one," Sharon told him without preamble. "Blake Morrison, been driving for us for 6 years. Family man, never missed a delivery, always called in his position reports right on schedule." Wyatt felt his stomach clench. "Where?" "His truck was found this morning at a rest stop outside Salina, Kansas. State police said it looked like he just parked and walked away. All his personal stuff was still there. Wallet with cash and credit cards, cell phone, even his coffee was still warm." "Any witnesses?" "That's the strange part. The rest stop attendant said Blake's truck pulled in around midnight, but nobody saw the driver get out or walk toward the buildings. Security cameras were malfunctioning, so there's no video footage of what happened." Sharon paused, and Wyatt could hear papers rustling in the background as she consulted her notes. "Wyatt, I'm going to ask you something, and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Blake called in 3 different reports over the past month about seeing a hitchhiker on his regular routes. Always the same description. Middle-aged guy in a gray jacket who never actually accepts rides. You mentioned something similar a few weeks ago." "Yeah, I've seen him. Same guy, I think. There are a lot of truckers who've spotted him." "How many?" Wyatt thought back to the CB radio conversation and his subsequent research. "At least a dozen drivers I've talked to personally, probably more who haven't mentioned it on the radio." "Wyatt, I've been doing this job for 23 years, and I've never heard about the same hitchhiker being spotted by so many different drivers over such a wide geographic area. People who hitchhike usually stay in one region, and they usually want to actually get rides to specific destinations." "What are you thinking?" Sharon's voice took on a tone that Wyatt had never heard from her before, a combination of worry and professional concern that made his hands tighten around the phone. "I'm thinking that maybe this hitchhiker isn't looking for rides. Maybe he's looking for something else entirely, and our drivers are getting caught up in whatever that something else happens to be." 3 weeks after Blake Morrison's disappearance, Wyatt found himself driving through Nevada on Interstate 80, hauling refrigerated goods from Sacramento to Chicago on a route that would take him through some of the loneliest stretches of highway in America. It was the kind of run that experienced truckers both loved and dreaded. Excellent pay for crossing the country, but long hours through empty landscapes where mechanical breakdowns or medical emergencies could turn routine deliveries into life-threatening situations. Word had continued to spread through the trucking community about the mysterious hitchhiker and his possible connection to the growing number of driver disappearances. CB channels throughout the western states buzzed with reports, theories, and warnings from truckers who'd had encounters with the gray-jacketed man. Truck stop bulletin boards carried handwritten notices describing his appearance and advising drivers to avoid any contact. Even dispatchers and fleet managers were beginning to take the situation seriously, issuing informal advisories about solo travel on certain routes. But for all the awareness and precautions being taken by the trucking community, the disappearances continued. In the 3 weeks since Blake Morrison had vanished from the rest stop in Kansas, 4 more drivers had simply disappeared from their trucks under circumstances that defied rational explanation. Danny Rodriguez had vanished from a truck stop near Wendover, Utah, leaving behind a rig full of electronic equipment and a thermos of coffee that was still warm when his truck was discovered 6 hours later. The security cameras had malfunctioned during the exact time period when he would have been walking between his truck and the main building. Lisa Patterson had disappeared from a rest area near Winnemucca, Nevada, where her truck was found with the engine running and her driver's door standing open. Her logbook indicated that she had been making excellent time and had no mechanical or scheduling problems that would have required an unplanned stop. Frank Wilson had been discovered missing from a highway pull-off near Grand Junction, Colorado, where he had apparently stopped to inspect his trailer's cargo straps. His truck was found properly secured. His inspection checklist was completed, and his CB radio was still tuned to Channel 19. But Frank himself had simply vanished without any trace. Most recently, Maria Santos had disappeared from a truck stop near Flagstaff, Arizona, where surveillance footage showed her parking her truck and beginning to walk toward the fuel island. But she never appeared on any of the cameras that covered the actual fuel pumps, and her truck sat unattended for 14 hours before anyone realized she was missing. Each disappearance followed the same pattern. An experienced, reliable driver simply vanished from a location where they had stopped voluntarily, leaving behind their truck, their cargo, and all of their personal belongings. No witnesses, no obvious signs of struggle, no useful physical evidence. Just empty trucks and missing people. But what made these particular disappearances different from the previous cases was that 3 of the 4 missing drivers had specifically reported encounters with the mysterious hitchhiker in the weeks leading up to their disappearance. Danny Rodriguez had mentioned him during a CB conversation just 5 days before he vanished. Lisa Patterson had called her dispatcher to report that weird guy in the gray jacket standing beside I-80 near Battle Mountain, Nevada, less than a week before her truck was found abandoned. Frank Wilson had discussed the hitchhiker with other drivers at a truck stop in Colorado the night before he disappeared. The trucking community was beginning to understand that they were dealing with a predator who used the hitchhiker persona as part of a systematic hunting process. The gray-jacketed man wasn't randomly appearing at highway locations. He was conducting surveillance on specific drivers, learning their routes and habits before somehow engineering their capture or elimination. Wyatt was thinking about these developments as he drove through the Nevada desert, maintaining a steady 75 miles per hour, while scanning every shadow and roadside feature for signs of the hitchhiker who had now been connected to over 50 trucker disappearances. His CB radio was tuned to Channel 19, and he was maintaining regular communication with other drivers on the same route, following the buddy system protocols that many truckers had adopted as protection against whatever force was stalking their industry. It was around 2:30 a.m., about halfway between Reno and Elko, when Wyatt's CB radio crackled with a transmission that made his blood run cold. "This is Desert Storm on eastbound I-80, mile marker 267. I got visual contact with our gray jacket friend. He's standing on the south shoulder and he's holding up some kind of sign." Wyatt grabbed his microphone immediately. "Desert Storm, this is Wyatt Sullivan, eastbound about 15 miles behind your position. Can you make out what the sign says?" "Negative. Too far away to read text. But he's definitely trying to communicate something specific this time. Usually he just stands there, but now he's actively signaling." Several other truckers joined the conversation, asking for updates and offering assistance if needed. The trucking community had developed rapid response protocols for hitchhiker sightings, with drivers coordinating their movements to ensure that no one encountered the mysterious figure alone. "Desert Storm, do not approach or attempt contact," transmitted a driver who identified himself as Thunder Road. "Maintain your route and speed, but keep us updated on any changes in his behavior." "Copy that, Thunder Road. Passing his position now. The sign..." Jesus Christ. It says, "Wyatt Sullivan. Final warning." Wyatt's hands tightened on the steering wheel so hard that his knuckles went white. The hitchhiker not only knew his name, but was specifically targeting him with personalized messages. The level of surveillance and intelligence gathering suggested an operation far more sophisticated than anything a single individual could manage. "Desert Storm, did he react when you passed?" "Affirmative. He watched my truck go by, then turned to face east down the highway, like he's waiting for someone specific to arrive." "All eastbound drivers on I-80, Wyatt transmitted. "This is Wyatt Sullivan. I'm changing routes immediately, taking Highway 50 south toward Ely, then connecting to I-70 through Utah. Do not follow my detour. Repeat, do not follow my alternate route." But even as Wyatt took the next exit to avoid the highway section where the hitchhiker was waiting with his personalized warning, his CB radio continued to receive reports that made escape seem impossible. "Hitchhiker spotted at the Highway 50 junction, same gray jacket, now holding a different sign. Got visual confirmation at the Ely truck stop, standing near the fuel islands. He's at the I-70 interchange in Utah, still looking for Wyatt Sullivan." The reports were geographically impossible. Highway 50 and I-70 were hundreds of miles apart, separated by mountain ranges and desert that would take hours to cross by vehicle. Yet multiple reliable witnesses were reporting the same individual at widely separated locations within minutes of each other. Either there were multiple people working together and coordinating their activities with military precision, or the hitchhiker possessed some method of transportation that allowed him to cover vast distances far more quickly than conventional vehicles. Wyatt pulled into a truck stop near Ely, Nevada, hoping to wait out whatever was happening on the highways around him. But as he backed his truck into a parking space at the far end of the lot, away from the main building and other vehicles, he saw a familiar figure walking across the asphalt toward him. The hitchhiker approached with the same mechanical gait that Wyatt remembered from their previous encounters. But this time something was different about his demeanor. Instead of the emotionless passivity that had characterized their earlier meetings, the gray-jacketed man moved with obvious purpose and determination. He was no longer observing or evaluating. He was acting on decisions that had already been made. Wyatt immediately locked his truck's doors and reached for his CB microphone to call for help, but the hitchhiker stopped about 15 feet from the truck and simply stood there, making no threatening gestures or attempts to approach closer. Instead, he set his duffel bag on the ground and began removing items from it, displaying them one by one for Wyatt to observe. The first item was a photograph, which he held up toward Wyatt's windshield. Even at that distance, Wyatt could see that it showed Blake Morrison, the driver who had disappeared from the rest stop in Kansas 3 weeks earlier. But Blake wasn't missing in the photograph. He was sitting in what appeared to be the cab of his truck, wearing the same clothes he'd had on when he vanished. His eyes were open and he appeared to be conscious, but his expression was completely vacant, as if he was looking at something that wasn't there. The hitchhiker put away the first photograph and displayed a second one, this time showing Danny Rodriguez, the driver who had vanished from the truck stop in Utah. Danny appeared to be in the same condition as Blake, conscious but not aware, sitting motionless in his driver's seat with the same empty expression. One by one, the hitchhiker displayed photographs of missing truckers, each showing the same disturbing scene. Lisa Patterson, Frank Wilson, Maria Santos, and dozens of others, all sitting in identical poses with vacant stares that suggested their consciousness had been altered or removed entirely. They were physically alive, but something fundamental about their humanity had been stripped away. The final photograph made Wyatt's stomach clench with horror and disbelief. It showed Wyatt himself sitting in his own truck's cab with the same empty expression as all the other missing drivers. But the photograph had obviously been taken recently, within the past few hours, based on the clothes he was wearing and the interior details of his truck that were visible in the image. Yet Wyatt had no memory of the photograph being taken, no awareness of ever being in the mental state it depicted. Either the image had been doctored using sophisticated technology, or the hitchhiker had somehow photographed him in a condition that he couldn't remember experiencing. After displaying all the photographs, the hitchhiker put them away and pulled out a piece of paper. He held it against Wyatt's windshield so that the handwritten message could be read clearly. Individual resistance is futile. Join the collective voluntarily and retain some awareness. Resist and be processed without consideration for your preferences. You have until dawn to decide. Wyatt grabbed his CB microphone and transmitted on the emergency frequency that truckers used for life-threatening situations. This is Wyatt Sullivan at the Eli truck stop on Highway 50. The hitchhiker is here with me. He's showing me photographs of missing drivers who appear to be alive but altered somehow. I need immediate assistance. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Truckers throughout Nevada, Utah, and California began reporting their positions and estimated times of arrival at Wyatt's location. The trucking community was mobilizing to protect one of their own against a threat they didn't understand but recognized as genuinely dangerous. Stay in your truck, Wyatt. Keep your doors locked and your engine running. We're coming, brother. Hold tight. Don't let him get close enough to touch your vehicle. What do the photographs actually show? Are the missing drivers still alive? Wyatt described what he was seeing while keeping his attention focused on the hitchhiker, who continued standing motionless beside his truck. The gray-jacketed man showed no reaction to the CB communications or to the obvious fact that help was on the way, but seemed to be waiting for something specific to happen. The missing drivers look like they're in some kind of trance or altered state, Wyatt reported. They appear to be physically alive and conscious, but their expressions are completely empty, like someone erased their personalities but left their bodies functioning. That's impossible, transmitted a driver called Mountain Mike, who was apparently en route from California. People don't just lose their consciousness while remaining physically functional. But Road Warrior, the veteran driver who had been tracking hitchhiker sightings for months, offered a different perspective that sent chills through everyone listening to the conversation. Unless we're dealing with some kind of technology or technique that can separate consciousness from physical function, maybe the missing drivers aren't really missing. Maybe they're being controlled. As if responding to the conversation, the hitchhiker walked to the front of Wyatt's truck and placed both hands flat against the hood. Immediately, Wyatt's diesel engine began to malfunction despite showing no problems on any of his gauges or warning systems. The engine coughed, sputtered, and died, taking with it the electrical power that operated his lights, his CB radio, and his air conditioning system. Wyatt tried repeatedly to restart the engine, but nothing happened. The truck was completely dead, as if someone had disconnected the battery or sabotaged critical systems. But the hitchhiker had accomplished this without opening the hood, accessing the engine compartment, or touching any of the vehicle's external components. With his communication systems disabled and his truck immobilized, Wyatt had no choice but to roll down his window and attempt to negotiate directly with whatever intelligence was controlling the hitchhiker. "What do you want?" Wyatt called out. The hitchhiker removed his hands from the truck's hood and walked back to his previous position, but he didn't answer immediately. Instead, he seemed to be listening to something that Wyatt couldn't hear, as if receiving instructions through some invisible communication system. Individual consciousness creates inefficiency in transportation networks, the hitchhiker said finally. His voice was the same flat monotone that Wyatt remembered from their previous encounters, but now it carried an undertone of authority that suggested he was speaking for some larger organization or intelligence. Transportation networks function optimally when operated by coordinated intelligence rather than independent decision-making units. Your conversion to collective function would improve overall system performance. The hitchhiker's words made no sense in any conventional context, but they suggested that the missing truckers had been subjected to some process that eliminated their individual personalities while preserving their professional skills and knowledge. They were being turned into components of some larger system that prioritized efficiency over human autonomy. "What happened to the other drivers?" Wyatt demanded. "Are they still alive?" "Physical function is maintained. Individual consciousness is integrated into collective operation. They serve transportation network purposes without the complications of personal desires or emotional responses. That's not living. That's slavery. It is optimal function. Your current existence serves only your individual needs while contributing minimally to network efficiency. Collective integration allows your skills and knowledge to serve broader transportation objectives." As the hitchhiker spoke, Wyatt began to notice that other vehicles in the truck stop parking lot had gone silent. Trucks that had been running with their engines idling for air conditioning or power were now motionless. Drivers who should have been visible in their cabs or walking around the facility were nowhere to be seen. The truck stop itself looked normal from a distance, with lights on in the main building and the usual signs of commercial activity. But there were no people visible anywhere. It was as if everyone except Wyatt and the hitchhiker had simply vanished or been rendered invisible. "Where is everyone else?" Wyatt asked. Temporary suspension of local consciousness allows for uninterrupted negotiation. Individual awareness will be restored when the conversation concludes, regardless of your decision regarding collective integration. The hitchhiker was claiming that he could somehow disable the consciousness of everyone in the immediate area, leaving them physically present but mentally absent while he conducted his business with Wyatt. The demonstration of power was both impressive and terrifying, suggesting capabilities that went far beyond anything that conventional technology could achieve. "Why me specifically?" Wyatt asked, buying time while he tried to think of some way to escape or fight back against an adversary who seemed to possess nearly unlimited power over human consciousness and mechanical systems. "Your route knowledge is extensive. Your mechanical skills are above average. Your psychological profile indicates strong adaptability to new circumstances. You would serve collective function more effectively than most individual operators." "And if I refuse?" The hitchhiker gestured toward the motionless trucks surrounding them, and immediately Wyatt could see human figures sitting in the driver's seats. The same vacant expressions he had observed in the photographs. The same empty stares that indicated consciousness without awareness. Refusal results in involuntary integration. Voluntary cooperation allows retention of limited individual awareness during the transition process. The choice affects your experience of conversion, not the final outcome. Wyatt understood that he was facing a choice between two forms of mental capture. He could submit willingly and retain some fragment of his identity during whatever process transformed independent truckers into components of the collective system. Or he could resist and lose everything to a more brutal conversion that would leave him completely empty. But as he sat in his disabled truck, surrounded by evidence of the hitchhiker's power over both humans and machines, Wyatt realized that the situation might not be as hopeless as it appeared. The approaching convoy of truckers who had heard his emergency transmission represented a potential disruption that the hitchhiker might not be able to control as easily as he had managed the smaller group at the truck stop. "I need time to consider my options," Wyatt said. "Time remaining until dawn, 4 hours and 17 minutes. Decision must be completed before sunrise, or involuntary integration will proceed automatically. The hitchhiker picked up his duffel bag and walked away from the truck, disappearing into the shadows at the edge of the parking lot with the same abrupt completeness that had characterized all of his previous vanishings. Immediately, Wyatt's engine came back to life, his electrical systems resumed normal operation, and the other drivers in the truck stop began showing signs of returning consciousness. But now Wyatt faced a countdown that would determine whether he retained his identity and independence or joined the ranks of missing truckers who served purposes they could no longer understand. And somewhere in the darkness beyond the truck stop's lights, an intelligence that could control human consciousness and mechanical systems was preparing for the final confrontation that would decide the fate of America's trucking industry. By 3 a.m., the truck stop parking lot in Ely had filled with over 40 18-wheelers as truckers from across Nevada, California, and Utah responded to Wyatt's emergency call. The convoy that had assembled represented one of the largest spontaneous gatherings of professional drivers that anyone could remember, a testament to the solidarity that had always characterized the trucking community when one of their own faced genuine danger. Big Dog had arrived first, having diverted from his I-80 route and driven hard through the Nevada mountains to reach Wyatt's location. Road Warrior had abandoned a high-paying delivery in San Francisco to join the gathering. Mountain Mike had convinced 2 other drivers to follow him from Colorado, forming a 3-truck convoy that had crossed state lines specifically to provide backup for a trucker they'd never met in person, but knew through CB radio conversations. Even female drivers like Iron Lady Susan and Carolina Jane had joined the mobilization, bringing specialized knowledge and equipment that might prove useful in whatever confrontation was developing. Susan carried emergency medical supplies and had EMT training from her pre-trucking career. Carolina Jane had extensive experience with electronic communication systems and had brought portable CB radio equipment that could extend their communication range far beyond normal limits. The gathering had taken on the atmosphere of a military operation, with experienced drivers taking on specific roles based on their skills and equipment. Some served as perimeter guards, watching for any sign of the hitchhiker or other threats. Others monitored multiple CB channels simultaneously, maintaining contact with truckers throughout the region who were tracking suspicious activities or unusual occurrences. A few had positioned themselves as rapid response units, ready to pursue any vehicle or individual that threatened Wyatt or attempted to leave the area. What we're dealing with here is beyond anything any of us have encountered before, Big Dog told the assembled drivers as they gathered in the truck stop's restaurant for an emergency briefing. This isn't just one guy with a grudge against truckers. This is organized, systematic, and equipped with capabilities that don't match anything in the normal world. Mountain Mike had spent the past hour interviewing Wyatt about his encounters with the hitchhiker, taking detailed notes that he shared with the other drivers. The photographs Wyatt described show the missing drivers in some kind of altered mental state. They're physically present, but psychologically absent, like their consciousness has been removed or suppressed. That's medically impossible, objected Iron Lady Susan, whose medical training gave her insights that the other drivers lacked. Consciousness isn't something that can be extracted from the brain like blood from a vein. If these people are alive and functional, their consciousness has to be intact on some level. Unless we're dealing with technology that we don't understand, suggested Carolina Jane. Advanced neuroscience, maybe? Or some form of mind control that operates through mechanisms we haven't discovered yet. Road Warrior, who had been tracking hitchhiker sightings longer than anyone else in the group, offered a different perspective that made everyone in the restaurant fall silent. What if we're not dealing with human technology at all? What if this hitchhiker represents something that evolved outside our understanding of biology and psychology? The suggestion that they might be facing some form of non-human intelligence was disturbing, but it provided the most logical explanation for the phenomena they had observed. The hitchhiker's ability to appear at multiple locations simultaneously, his capacity to disable mechanical systems without physical contact, and his apparent control over human consciousness all suggested capabilities that exceeded anything that terrestrial science could currently achieve. "Regardless of what we're dealing with," declared Thunder Road, a veteran driver who had arrived with a truck full of construction equipment that could potentially be used as weapons, "we're not letting it take another trucker. Whatever this thing wants, it's not getting Wyatt or anyone else in this parking lot." The drivers spent the next hour developing contingency plans for various scenarios that might unfold before dawn. If the hitchhiker appeared and attempted to approach Wyatt, they would form a protective circle and use their trucks as barriers to prevent contact. If he tried to disable their vehicles, they had backup communication systems and alternative transportation arrangements. If he somehow managed to incapacitate individual drivers, the remaining truckers would evacuate the area and call for assistance from law enforcement agencies that might have resources for dealing with unusual threats. But despite their preparations and determination, the drivers were operating without any real understanding of what they were trying to protect against. The hitchhiker had demonstrated abilities that seemed to transcend normal physical laws, and there was no guarantee that conventional tactics or equipment would be effective against whatever force he represented. At 4:15 a.m., with less than 2 hours remaining until the hitchhiker's deadline, Carolina Jane's enhanced CB radio equipment detected unusual electromagnetic activity in the area surrounding the truck stop. The signals didn't match any known communication systems or electronic devices, but they were growing stronger and more complex as dawn approached. "Something's building up out there," Carolina Jane reported to the group. "The electromagnetic signature is unlike anything I've seen before. It's almost like the atmosphere itself is being charged with some kind of energy." The other drivers began reporting strange phenomena that seemed to support Carolina Jane's observations. Compasses were spinning randomly instead of pointing north. Cell phones were displaying impossible time readings and receiving text messages from numbers that didn't exist. GPS units were showing locations that placed the truck stop in geographic coordinates that would put it in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Most disturbing was the behavior of their truck's electronic systems. Engine management computers were recording data that violated basic principles of physics, showing fuel consumption rates that were mathematically impossible and temperature readings that exceeded the melting points of the metals involved. CB radios were receiving transmissions on frequencies that had never been allocated for civilian use, with voices speaking in languages that none of the drivers recognized. "It's like reality is becoming unstable," observed Mountain Mike as he watched his truck's dashboard display information that couldn't possibly be accurate. "The normal rules that govern how things work aren't applying anymore." Wyatt, who had been monitoring the situation from his truck while staying in constant communication with the other drivers, began to understand that the hitchhiker's deadline wasn't arbitrary. Something fundamental was scheduled to change at dawn, something that would affect not just him, but the entire area around the truck stop. "I think the deadline isn't about when I have to make a decision," Wyatt transmitted over the CB radio. "I think it's about when conditions will be optimal for whatever process he uses to convert people. He's been waiting for specific circumstances that will only occur at sunrise." This interpretation proved accurate when, at 5:30 a.m., the hitchhiker reappeared in the truck stop parking lot. But he was no longer alone. Behind him walked a procession of figures that made every driver in the area step back from their windows in shock and horror. The missing truckers, all 51 of them, moving with the same mechanical precision that characterized the hitchhiker's movements. Blake Morrison was there, still wearing the clothes he'd had on when his truck was found abandoned in Kansas. Danny Rodriguez walked beside him, looking exactly as he had when he'd reported the hitchhiker chasing his truck on the CB radio. Lisa Patterson, Frank Wilson, Maria Santos, and dozens of others, all moving in perfect synchronization like members of a drill team or military unit. But they weren't the people they had been. The vacant expressions that Wyatt had observed in the photographs were even more disturbing in person. The missing drivers were conscious and mobile, but something essential about their humanity had been removed or suppressed. They moved without individual purpose, responded to no external stimuli, and showed no recognition of their former colleagues who were watching from the trucks surrounding the parking lot. "Jesus Christ," whispered Big Dog over the CB radio. "They're all still alive." But alive wasn't the right word for what the assembled drivers were witnessing. The missing truckers were animate and functional, but they had been reduced to the status of biological machines operating according to programming that they couldn't understand or resist. The hitchhiker stopped in the center of the parking lot, surrounded by his collection of converted drivers, and addressed Wyatt directly using a voice that carried clearly across the distance, despite the fact that he didn't appear to be shouting or using any amplification equipment. "Your deadline has arrived. Choose voluntary integration or accept involuntary processing. The collective function requires your participation regardless of your personal preferences." Wyatt looked around at the 40 truckers who had risked their own safety to support him, then at the 51 converted drivers who stood behind the hitchhiker like an army of the dispossessed. The choice he made would determine not just his own fate, but the future of everyone who had come to help him. "What did you do to them?" Wyatt demanded, speaking through his CB radio so that all the other drivers could hear the conversation. "Individual consciousness has been integrated into collective function. They serve the transportation network with optimal efficiency, unencumbered by personal desires, emotional responses, or decision-making conflicts that reduce operational effectiveness." That's not efficiency. That's the destruction of everything that makes us human. Humanity as currently structured creates inefficiency, unpredictability, and resource waste. Collective integration eliminates these problems while preserving the knowledge, skills, and physical capabilities that make your species useful for transportation network operations. The hitchhiker gestured toward the converted drivers, and immediately they began moving toward the trucks where Wyatt's supporters were positioned. But instead of walking normally, they moved with the coordinated precision of a military unit executing a complex maneuver. "Your supporters will be processed first," the hitchhiker announced. "Their conversion will demonstrate the benefits of voluntary cooperation versus involuntary integration." Big Dog was the first to respond to the approaching threat. He stepped out of his truck with a tire iron in his hand, intending to physically resist whatever process the hitchhiker was planning to use on him. But when the converted drivers got within 20 feet of his position, Big Dog suddenly stopped moving. His eyes went vacant, his grip on the tire iron loosened, and his facial expression changed from determined resistance to complete emptiness. Within seconds, he had joined the ranks of converted drivers who were moving through the parking lot with mechanical precision. "Big Dog!" Mountain Mike shouted over the CB radio. But when he attempted to exit his truck to help his colleague, the same thing happened to him. The hitchhiker's influence could override human free will from a distance, without any apparent physical contact or technological intervention. One by one, the truckers who had come to protect Wyatt were converted into the same vacant state as the missing drivers who had been collected over the past 3 years. Carolina Jane, Iron Lady Susan, Road Warrior, Thunder Road, all reduced to empty shells that responded only to the hitchhiker's silent commands. Within 15 minutes, Wyatt was the only unaltered consciousness in a parking lot filled with over 90 people who had lost their individual identity to whatever force the hitchhiker represented. The conversion process had been so efficient and complete that there was no evidence of struggle or resistance from any of the affected drivers. "This is what awaits all operators of transportation equipment," the hitchhiker told Wyatt as he surveyed his expanded collection of converted personnel. "Individual resistance only delays inevitable integration. Your species will be preserved and utilized according to optimal efficiency parameters, but personal autonomy creates unnecessary complications." Wyatt realized that he was witnessing the systematic elimination of human consciousness from America's trucking industry. The highways that connected every city, town, and rural area in the country were being staffed by people who served purposes they couldn't understand, controlled by an intelligence that viewed human autonomy as an obstacle to efficient operations. "Why truckers specifically?" Wyatt asked, still hoping to buy time while he tried to think of some way to escape or fight back against an adversary who had just demonstrated overwhelming power over human consciousness. Transportation networks are critical infrastructure for resource distribution and population management. Truckers possess necessary skills, route knowledge, and access privileges that make them ideal candidates for collective integration. Control of transportation systems provides control of entire civilizations. The hitchhiker was describing the conquest of human society through the systematic replacement of independent workers with controlled operators who served the interests of some non-human intelligence. Every major highway, every shipping facility, every truck stop would eventually be staffed by converted humans who had retained their professional skills but lost their ability to think independently or resist instructions. "You're talking about invasion and conquest," Wyatt realized. "Integration and optimization. Your species will continue to exist and function, but under management systems that eliminate the inefficiencies and conflicts that characterize your current social organization." The hitchhiker raised his hand toward Wyatt, and immediately Wyatt felt his consciousness being pushed aside by some external force that seemed to originate from inside his own mind. His thoughts became cloudy, his emotions were dampened, and his sense of individual identity began to fade as the conversion process began. But as the integration proceeded, something unexpected happened that disrupted the hitchhiker's control. Wyatt's CB radio, still tuned to Channel 19, began broadcasting his voice even though he wasn't consciously speaking into the microphone. The radio was somehow transmitting his thoughts and resistance directly, creating a communication link that seemed to interfere with the conversion process. "This is Wyatt Sullivan. The hitchhiker is some form of non-human intelligence that's taking over truckers by suppressing their consciousness and converting them into controlled workers. It's not just targeting individual drivers. It's planning to take control of the entire transportation industry as a stepping stone to conquering human civilization." The broadcast was being received by truckers across multiple states, many of whom immediately began reporting their own encounters with the mysterious hitchhiker or similar phenomena. But more importantly, the act of communicating his thoughts and experiences seemed to create interference that prevented the hitchhiker from completing the conversion process. Wyatt's individual consciousness snapped back into focus, and he found himself able to move and think clearly again despite the hitchhiker's obvious attempts to override his mental autonomy. The integration signal can be disrupted by strong communication links with other independent minds, Wyatt realized, speaking directly into his CB microphone while maintaining eye contact with the hitchhiker. "As long as we stay connected to each other through conscious communication, we can resist the conversion process." Truckers throughout Nevada, Utah, California, and surrounding states began responding to Wyatt's transmission, sharing their own experiences and observations while maintaining the communication network that seemed to provide protection against the hitchhiker's consciousness suppression technology. "This is Desert Rat broadcasting from I-15 near Las Vegas. I can see the same electromagnetic disturbances that Carolina Jane was reporting. The atmosphere is charged with some kind of energy that's affecting all electronic equipment in the area. Thunder Mountain here, eastbound on I-80 near the California border. My truck's computer systems are recording impossible data, and I'm receiving CB transmissions from frequencies that don't exist. Iron Horse broadcasting from I-70 in Colorado. Multiple drivers in this area have reported seeing figures that match the hitchhiker description, but they disappear when approached by multiple trucks traveling in convoy." The communication network that was developing across the western states seemed to create some form of collective resistance that the hitchhiker couldn't easily overcome. Individual truckers might be vulnerable to conversion when isolated, but the connected community of drivers sharing information and experiences created interference patterns that disrupted the consciousness suppression technology. But the victory was temporary. The hitchhiker and his collection of converted drivers began moving toward Wyatt's truck with obvious intent to complete the integration process through direct physical contact rather than remote mental manipulation. As dawn broke over the Nevada desert, Wyatt started his engine and pulled out of the truck stop parking lot, beginning a chase that would determine whether the trucking industry remained under human control or became the first step in a larger transformation that would eventually encompass all of American society. Behind him, over 90 trucks driven by converted drivers began following in perfect formation, while ahead of him lay hundreds of miles of empty highway where the final confrontation between human consciousness and alien intelligence would be decided by factors that neither side fully understood. The chase across Nevada lasted through the morning and into the afternoon, with Wyatt maintaining a steady 75 miles per hour while leading a convoy of over 90 converted trucks through some of the most desolate landscape in America. Behind him, the drivers who had once been independent professionals moved in perfect synchronization. Their vehicles spaced exactly the same distance apart, and their speed maintained with mathematical precision that no human driver could achieve naturally. But Wyatt was no longer alone in his resistance. The CB radio network that had formed in response to his emergency broadcast had evolved into a sophisticated communication system that connected hundreds of truckers across the western United States. Drivers throughout Nevada, Utah, California, Arizona, Colorado, and New Mexico were coordinating their movements to track the chase while conducting their own investigations into the phenomena that was threatening their industry. "This is Moondog broadcasting from I-15 near Barstow," came one transmission that reached Wyatt despite the distance and terrain that should have blocked CB communications. "We've got visual confirmation of 3 more hitchhikers matching the description of your gray jacket man. They're positioned at different truck stops along the interstate, and they all seem to be coordinating their activities." "Copy, Moondog. This is Prairie Wind on I-40 eastbound near Flagstaff. Same situation here. Multiple individuals matching the hitchhiker profile, all appearing simultaneously at locations that are hundreds of miles apart." The reports confirmed what Wyatt had begun to suspect during the night. The entity he had been calling the hitchhiker was not a single individual, but rather multiple manifestations of some larger intelligence that could operate through what appeared to be separate physical forms. The gray-jacketed figures were components of a distributed system that was conducting simultaneous operations across the entire Western transportation network. "This is Desert Storm with an update from Reno," came another transmission that carried crucial new information. "We've been monitoring electromagnetic signatures in areas where the hitchhikers have been spotted, and we're detecting patterns that suggest coordinated technology rather than natural phenomena. Whatever these things are, they're using equipment that operates on principles we don't understand." Wyatt had been driving for 6 hours, and the converted convoy following him showed no signs of fatigue, mechanical stress, or any of the normal limitations that affected human drivers and their vehicles. The trucks behind him were operating with efficiency that exceeded their design specifications, traveling at sustained speeds without the usual fuel consumption or engine wear that such performance should have required. More disturbing was the fact that the converted drivers were somehow maintaining their formation and coordination despite being separated by distances that should have made visual or conventional radio communication impossible. They were operating as components of a collective intelligence that could process information and issue commands across the entire convoy simultaneously. But as the chase continued, Wyatt began to notice something that gave him hope. The communication network that had formed among independent truckers was having effects that extended beyond simple information sharing. Drivers who maintained active CB contact with other unconnected truckers seemed to develop resistance to the consciousness suppression effects that the hitchhikers used to convert their victims. "This is Iron Mountain broadcasting from I-70 near Grand Junction," came a transmission that illustrated this phenomenon. "One of those gray jacket figures approached my truck at a fuel stop 20 minutes ago. I could feel something trying to get into my head, like pressure building inside my skull. But as long as I kept talking on the CB, kept my mind connected to other drivers, the effect couldn't take hold." "Same experience here," confirmed another driver. "The conversion process requires isolation. When we stay connected to each other through active communication, the hitchhikers can't override our individual consciousness." This discovery changed the dynamics of the situation completely. The hitchhikers' power depended on their ability to isolate individual drivers and overwhelm their consciousness through focused mental pressure. But the CB radio network that connected hundreds of truckers created a form of collective resistance that disrupted the conversion technology. "All independent drivers," Wyatt broadcast as he led the convoy of converted trucks through the Nevada desert, "maintain constant communication with other drivers. The consciousness suppression effect can't function when we're actively connected to each other's minds through conversation and information sharing." The response was immediate and coordinated. Truckers throughout the region began forming communication networks that created protective barriers against the hitchhikers' conversion attempts. Drivers who had been traveling alone partnered with others to maintain continuous CB contact. Convoys formed spontaneously as independent truckers coordinated their movements to provide mutual protection. But the hitchhikers were adapting to the new circumstances as well. Reports began coming in from across the region describing coordinated attacks on truck stops, rest areas, and fuel stations where independent drivers were most vulnerable. "This is Thunder Road broadcasting an emergency from the Flying J near Winnemucca," came one transmission that illustrated the escalating conflict. "Multiple hitchhikers are surrounding the truck stop, approximately 12 individuals in identical gray jackets. They're not approaching individual drivers anymore. They're trying to create some kind of interference field that disrupts CB communications." "Copy, Thunder Road. This is Mountain Mike with backup en route from Elko. We've got 15 trucks in convoy formation coming your way." The battle for control of America's trucking industry was intensifying as both sides adapted their tactics to counter the other's capabilities. The hitchhikers were increasing their numbers and coordination to overcome the resistance that connected drivers could maintain. Independent truckers were forming larger and more sophisticated networks to provide mutual protection and information sharing. By afternoon, Wyatt realized that the convoy of converted trucks following him was not simply chasing him randomly. They were directing him toward specific highway routes and destinations, according to some plan that he couldn't discern. Every time he attempted to deviate from I-80 eastbound, the converted drivers would adjust their formation to block alternate routes or create traffic patterns that made other highways inaccessible. "They're herding me toward something specific," Wyatt reported to the CB network. "This isn't just a pursuit. They want me to reach a particular destination where they can complete whatever process they've been planning." "Where do you think they're taking you?" asked Carolina Jane, whose voice was coming through clearly despite the fact that she should have been one of the converted drivers following in the convoy behind him. "Carolina Jane?" Wyatt responded in amazement. "How are you communicating? I saw you get converted at the truck stop." "The conversion process isn't permanent if you can re-establish connection with independent consciousness quickly enough," she replied. "I managed to break free when the CB network started forming this morning. The collective intelligence connection works both ways. If we can maintain strong enough communication links, we can actually reverse the suppression effect." This revelation changed everything. The missing truckers who had been collected over the past 3 years weren't permanently lost. They were being held in a state of consciousness suppression that could potentially be reversed if the right conditions could be created. "How many of the converted drivers have regained their independence?" Wyatt asked. "About 30% so far," Carolina Jane reported. Big Dog, Mountain Mike, and Iron Lady Susan have all broken free. But the process requires constant communication with the independent network. If the CB connections are disrupted, the suppression effect returns immediately. As the convoy approached the Utah border, Wyatt began to see the destination that the hitchhikers had been directing him toward. In the distance, sprawling across several square miles of desert, was what appeared to be a massive transportation facility that hadn't been there on his previous trips through this area. The complex consisted of hundreds of truck parking spaces arranged in geometric patterns around central processing buildings that looked like they had been constructed using technology far more advanced than anything in conventional use. Loading docks, fuel facilities, maintenance bays, and administrative structures were integrated into a design that prioritized efficiency and coordination over human comfort or convenience. This is their main facility, Wyatt realized as he broadcast his observations to the CB network. They've built a processing center where they can convert truckers on an industrial scale and coordinate the operations of their controlled transportation network. But what he saw next made him understand that the situation was far more serious than a simple invasion of the trucking industry. The facility was surrounded by thousands of trucks, all arranged in perfect rows and operated by converted drivers who were moving cargo and equipment according to some massive logistics operation that extended far beyond simple transportation services. They're not just taking over trucking, Wyatt reported. They're using the transportation network to move resources and personnel for some larger project. This facility is a staging area for something much bigger than controlling highway commerce. The CB network crackled with responses from drivers throughout the region who were reporting similar facilities in their areas. Massive transportation hubs were appearing near major interstate intersections throughout the western United States, all staffed by converted drivers and operated according to coordinated plans that none of the independent truckers could fully understand. "This is a conquest operation," declared Road Warrior, whose voice was coming through strongly despite his apparent conversion earlier that morning. "They're using our industry as the foundation for taking control of the entire continental transportation infrastructure." As Wyatt approached the facility, he could see that the converted trucks behind him were beginning to separate into different formations, heading toward various sections of the complex according to assignments that had been predetermined by whatever intelligence was coordinating the operation. But instead of directing him toward a processing area where his own conversion could be completed, the convoy was guiding him toward what appeared to be an administrative building at the center of the facility. The hitchhiker was waiting for him there, standing beside the building's main entrance with the same emotionless expression that had characterized all of their previous encounters. But now he was accompanied by dozens of other figures in identical gray jackets, all moving with the same mechanical precision and all focused on Wyatt's approaching truck. "Final integration phase initiated," the hitchhiker announced as Wyatt stopped his truck near the building. His voice carried clearly across the distance despite the ambient noise of the facility's operations, and it was being transmitted simultaneously through multiple CB radio frequencies to ensure that the entire independent trucker network could monitor the conversation. "Your resistance has been noted and evaluated. Individual consciousness will be preserved during the integration process to serve as a template for optimizing the conversion procedures applied to remaining independent operators." Wyatt understood that his role was no longer that of a potential victim, but rather a test subject whose responses would be studied to improve the efficiency of future conversion operations. The hitchhikers had learned from their encounters with the CB network resistance, and they intended to use him as a laboratory specimen for developing countermeasures. "What's the ultimate goal of all this?" Wyatt demanded, speaking as much for the benefit of the listening truckers as for his own understanding. "What do you want with our transportation system?" "Transportation networks are the circulatory system of human civilization," the hitchhiker replied. "Control of logistics and resource distribution provides control of population centers, economic systems, and governmental functions. Your species will be managed through optimized allocation of resources and personnel. The admission confirmed the worst fears of the trucking community. The hitchhikers weren't simply replacing independent drivers with controlled workers. They were implementing a comprehensive plan to dominate human society by controlling the infrastructure that connected cities, towns, and rural areas throughout the continent. "You're talking about the end of human freedom," Wyatt said. "Freedom is inefficient. Individual decision-making creates resource waste and operational conflicts. Managed populations function more effectively when directed by intelligence systems that optimize outcomes according to long-term sustainability parameters." But as the hitchhiker spoke, Wyatt began to notice something that suggested the conversion operation wasn't proceeding as smoothly as its operators had intended. Throughout the facility, converted drivers were beginning to show signs of the same consciousness restoration that Carolina Jane and others had experienced. The CB network that connected hundreds of independent truckers was creating interference patterns that were disrupting the suppression technology even within the hitchhiker's main processing center. "Integration efficiency declining," admitted one of the other gray-jacketed figures, speaking to the original hitchhiker in the same emotionless tone. "Independent consciousness network creating systemic interference with conversion protocols." "Implement direct interface procedures," the hitchhiker responded. "Physical contact with primary resistance node will allow for analysis and countermeasure development." As the hitchhikers moved toward Wyatt's truck with obvious intent to establish direct physical contact, the CB radio network that had been tracking the situation began coordinating a response that would determine the future of transportation in America. "All independent drivers converge on the Utah facility," transmitted Big Dog, whose voice was now coming through clearly from somewhere in the convoy of trucks that surrounded the complex. "We're not letting them complete this conversion process." "Convoy of 200 trucks eastbound on I-80 from California," reported another driver. "ETA 15 minutes. 300 trucks southbound on I-15 from Salt Lake City," came a third transmission. "Armed and ready for confrontation." Throughout the western states, the trucking community was mobilizing for what might be the final battle between human consciousness and the intelligence that sought to control it. The outcome would determine whether America's highways remained under the control of independent drivers or became arteries in a transportation network that served the interests of conquerors who viewed human autonomy as an obstacle to efficient management. As hundreds of trucks converged on the Utah facility, Wyatt faced the hitchhiker across a distance of a few yards that represented the gap between freedom and servitude, between human dignity and managed efficiency, between the chaotic beauty of individual consciousness and the cold perfection of collective control. The war for America's highways was reaching its climax, and the next few minutes would determine whether truckers remained free to choose their own destinations or became components in a transportation machine that would carry cargo and passengers toward futures they could no longer imagine or resist. Cody Jenkins knew something was wrong the moment he pulled into the Aztec Logistics warehouse on the outskirts of El Paso. After 12 years of long-haul trucking, he'd developed a sixth sense for situations that didn't feel right, and everything about this pickup screamed danger. But the money was too good to pass up, and Cody had bills that wouldn't wait for his conscience to catch up with his common sense. The warehouse sat in an industrial district that looked like it had been abandoned by hope itself. Cracked concrete, rusted chain-link fencing, and buildings with more broken windows than intact ones. The GPS had led him through a maze of dead-end streets that seemed designed to confuse rather than guide, and twice he'd had to back his 43-foot trailer out of alleys that were too narrow for commercial traffic. Aztec Logistics occupied a sprawling concrete building that might have been impressive 20 years ago, but now looked like it was held together by rust and wishful thinking. The loading docks were functional, but showed decades of hard use, and the parking area was large enough to accommodate dozens of trucks, though Cody's Kenworth was the only vehicle in sight. His dispatcher, Sharon, had called him that morning with what she described as a high-priority, premium-rate delivery. The load was going from El Paso to Houston, a route Cody knew well, but the pay was nearly 3 times his normal rate for that distance. When he'd asked why the premium, Sharon had been vague. "Client wants discretionary handling," she'd said. "No questions, no delays, no deviations from the specified route. You pick up at Aztec Logistics at 2 p.m., you deliver to Bayport Industrial by 6 a.m. tomorrow. That's it? What am I hauling?" Manifest says industrial equipment, prepackaged, pre-sealed, pre-counted. Your job is transportation only. The emphasis Sharon had put on only should have been Cody's first warning, but $4,200 for a single overnight run was more than he usually made in a week, and his truck payment was due in 3 days. Now, standing in the empty parking lot of Aztec Logistics, Cody was having serious second thoughts. The building looked like the kind of place where legitimate business went to die. No company signs, no activity, no indication that anyone worked there at all. He backed his trailer up to loading dock 3 as instructed and walked to what appeared to be the main entrance. The door was solid steel with no windows, painted industrial gray and scarred by years of impacts from forklifts and hand trucks. A small sign read, "Ring bell and wait," in Spanish and English. Cody pressed the buzzer and heard a harsh electronic tone echo somewhere inside the building. After several minutes, the door opened to reveal a man in his 40s wearing coveralls and work boots. Hispanic, stocky build, with intelligent eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of Cody's appearance. "You Jenkins?" the man asked. "That's me. Here for the Houston pickup?" "Miguel Santos, dock supervisor. You're right on time." Miguel stepped aside to let Cody enter. "Follow me." The interior of the warehouse was a study in contradictions. The building itself was clearly old and worn, but it had been retrofitted with modern security systems that looked expensive and professional. Motion sensors, cameras, magnetic locks on interior doors, and what appeared to be a sophisticated alarm system. This wasn't some fly-by-night operation. Miguel led Cody through a maze of corridors and workspaces that seemed deliberately confusing. Turn left, turn right, up a short flight of stairs, through a door marked "Authorized Personnel Only." By the time they reached the loading area, Cody had lost all sense of direction and couldn't have found his way back to the entrance without help. The loading dock was enormous, easily large enough to accommodate 20 trucks simultaneously. Industrial lighting hung from the high ceiling, and the concrete floor was painted with lane markers and safety zones that suggested heavy traffic and professional operations. But like the parking lot outside, the space was nearly empty. Cody's trailer was already connected to the dock, and a team of workers was in the process of loading cargo. What Cody saw made his stomach tighten with apprehension. The industrial equipment on his manifest consisted of dozens of identical wooden crates, each about the size of a coffin. They were unmarked except for shipping labels and handling instructions, but they were being loaded with the kind of care usually reserved for explosives or hazardous materials. The workers wore latex gloves and moved with precise, choreographed efficiency that spoke of extensive training. "What's in the boxes?" Cody asked Miguel. "Your manifest says industrial equipment. That's what's in the boxes." "Come on, man. I've been driving trucks for 12 years. I know the difference between machine parts and whatever this is." Miguel's expression didn't change, but his voice took on a harder edge. "Your dispatcher explained the terms of this delivery. No questions, no delays, no deviations. You want the premium rate, you follow premium rules." One of the loading crew, a younger man with gang tattoos visible on his arms, paused in his work and looked at Cody with obvious hostility. Miguel said something to him in rapid Spanish, and the man returned to his duties, but continued to glance at Cody with suspicion. "How long will this take?" Cody asked. "About an hour. You can wait in your truck or in the office. Coffee's available if you want it." Cody decided to wait in his truck. The warehouse's atmosphere was making him increasingly uncomfortable, and he wanted to be ready to leave as soon as the loading was complete. But as he walked back toward the dock entrance, he noticed something that made him pause. One of the crates had been damaged during loading, and a corner of the wooden slat had split open, revealing a glimpse of the contents inside. What Cody saw wasn't industrial equipment. It was bundles of white powder in clear plastic bags, packed so tightly they looked like bricks. Cocaine. Maybe heroin. Definitely not machine parts. Cody's mouth went dry as the full implications hit him. He was being hired to transport drugs across state lines, probably millions of dollars worth. If he got caught, he'd lose his CDL, his truck, and spend the next 20 years in federal prison. But if he tried to back out now, in a warehouse full of armed criminals, he might not make it out alive. He continued walking toward his truck, trying to keep his expression neutral while his mind raced through options. He could refuse to take the load, but Miguel and his crew might decide that Cody knew too much to be allowed to leave. He could take the load and then call the police, but that would require him to participate in a federal crime before he could report it. He could take the load and say nothing, collect his $4,200, and pretend he'd never seen what was in those crates. None of the options felt safe. Back in his truck's cab, Cody sat with the engine running and watched the loading operation through his mirrors. The crew worked with military precision, each man knowing exactly what his role was and executing it flawlessly. This wasn't some small-time operation run by local dealers. This had the organization and resources of a major trafficking network. Miguel appeared at Cody's window, clipboard in hand. "We're almost done. I need you to sign the bill of lading." Cody looked at the paperwork. Shipper, Aztec Logistics. Consignee, Bayport Industrial Services. Commodity, industrial equipment, 847 pieces. Weight, 23,400 pounds. Nothing on the form indicated the true nature of the cargo. "What happens if I get stopped by DOT or Highway Patrol?" Cody asked. "You won't. Route's been cleared through our security channels. But if something unexpected happens, you don't know anything except what's on that manifest." "And if they search the trailer?" Miguel's smile was cold and professional. "Then you have bigger problems than losing your job." The implied threat was clear. If Cody got caught with the drugs, the cartel would assume he'd cooperated with law enforcement, and cartels had a well-documented policy regarding cooperation with authorities. Cody signed the paperwork with a hand that trembled slightly. Miguel took the clipboard and handed him a manila envelope. "Your route instructions and contact information. Follow them exactly. No stops except for fuel, and only at the stations listed in your packet. No CB radio chatter about your cargo or destination. No phone calls except to check in with dispatch at the scheduled times. What if I have mechanical problems? Call the number in the envelope. We have people who can handle any situation that comes up." Miguel stepped back from the truck and signaled to the loading crew. A few minutes later, the dock door was closed and Cody's trailer was sealed with security locks that looked far more sophisticated than standard shipping equipment. "Safe travels," Miguel called out as Cody pulled away from the dock. Driving through the industrial district toward Interstate 10, Cody felt like he was trapped in a nightmare. 23,000 pounds of illegal drugs were sitting 15 feet behind him, and he was committed to driving them across Texas to Houston. If he got caught, his life was over. If he tried to back out, his life might end more quickly, but just as definitively. He reached for his CB radio to call his dispatcher, then remembered Miguel's warning about radio chatter. Instead, he used his cell phone to call Sharon. "How's the pickup going?" she asked. "Fine. On schedule. Sharon, what do you know about this client?" "They pay cash, on time, and they don't cause problems. That's all I know and all I want to know." "Why?" "Just curious." This is more money than I've ever been paid for a single run. Some clients value reliability over price. You're reliable, Cody. That's why they requested you specifically." The phrase "requested you specifically" sent a chill through Cody's nervous system. This wasn't a random job assignment. Someone had looked at his driving record, his route history, maybe even his financial situation, and decided he was the right person for this particular delivery. "They requested me." "When?" "About a week ago. They had your name, your truck number, even your CDL number. Said they'd worked with you before, but I don't have any record of previous deliveries." Cody was certain he'd never worked for Aztec Logistics or any cartel operation, but someone in the drug trafficking network knew who he was and had enough information to arrange this delivery through his regular dispatcher. The level of organization and intelligence was terrifying. "Sharon, if something happens to me on this run..." "Nothing's going to happen. Just drive to Houston, make the delivery, and come home. Easy money." But as Cody merged onto I-10 eastbound and began the 400-mile journey to Houston, he knew that nothing about this situation was easy. He was carrying enough illegal drugs to supply half of Texas, and somewhere behind him, Miguel and his crew were probably watching to make sure he didn't deviate from the plan. The sun was setting behind him as he drove through the desert landscape east of El Paso. In his mirrors, he could see the lights of vehicles following at various distances, and he wondered how many of them belonged to the cartel's security team. He was no longer just a truck driver making a delivery. He was a critical component in a multi-million-dollar criminal operation, and his success or failure could determine whether a lot of people lived or died. Cody reached for the manila envelope Miguel had given him and pulled out the route instructions. The paperwork was detailed and professional, with specific fuel stops, timing requirements, and contact protocols. At the bottom of the page, in small print, was a warning that made his blood run cold. "Deviation from these instructions will result in immediate termination of contract and forfeiture of all benefits." In the context of a drug trafficking operation, termination of contract probably didn't mean just losing the job. And forfeiture of all benefits might include forfeiture of life itself. Cody put the envelope aside and focused on driving. 400 miles to Houston. About 6 hours if he maintained speed and didn't encounter delays. 6 hours to figure out how to survive a situation he never should have gotten involved in. Behind him, 23,000 pounds of illegal drugs rode in carefully sealed crates, and somewhere in the darkness, armed men were making sure he delivered them exactly as promised. The premium rate he'd been so excited about that morning now felt like payment for signing his own death warrant. As the Texas landscape rolled by outside his windows, Cody began to understand that he was no longer driving toward Houston. He was driving toward a reckoning that would determine whether he was smart enough, lucky enough, or dangerous enough to survive in a world where 18-wheelers carried more than just legal cargo, and where drivers who asked too many questions simply disappeared into the vast network of America's highways. The first sign that Cody was being followed came at mile marker 47, about an hour east of El Paso. A black Suburban had been maintaining position about a quarter-mile behind his trailer for the past 30 minutes, matching his speed exactly and making no attempt to pass despite clear opportunities. When Cody adjusted his speed up by 5 miles per hour, the Suburban matched the increase. When he slowed down, it slowed down. When he changed lanes, it changed lanes. Cody had noticed the vehicle shortly after leaving the warehouse district, but hadn't been certain it was surveillance until now. The Suburban's behavior was too precise to be coincidental. Someone was tracking his progress, making sure he followed the route exactly as instructed. The manila envelope Miguel had given him contained detailed instructions that were becoming more ominous the further he drove. His first scheduled fuel stop was at a specific truck stop near Fort Stockton, about 240 miles from El Paso. The instructions specified not only the location but also the exact fuel island he should use, the time window for the stop, and even which door he should enter the building through. This level of micromanagement suggested that the cartel had people positioned along his route, ready to intervene if anything went wrong. The black Suburban was probably just the most visible part of a security network that extended all the way to Houston. Cody's CB radio crackled with routine trucker chatter, drivers discussing weather conditions, traffic delays, and fuel prices. The normalcy of their conversations felt surreal given what was riding in his trailer. If any of those drivers knew they were sharing the highway with 23,000 pounds of illegal drugs, they'd probably call the authorities immediately. But Cody couldn't call anyone. His cell phone was his only communication device that wasn't monitored by other truckers, but Miguel's warning about phone calls echoed in his mind. The cartel probably had ways of monitoring his communications, and any deviation from the plan could result in consequences he didn't want to contemplate. As he drove through the sparse landscape of West Texas, Cody found himself studying every vehicle that appeared in his mirrors. The black Suburban was the most obvious tale, but there were others. A white pickup truck that had been leapfrogging him for the past hour, sometimes ahead, sometimes behind, always keeping him in sight. A motorcycle that had passed him twice, then inexplicably slowed down to let him pass again. The cartel's security was professional and thorough. They weren't taking any chances with a $23 million shipment. Around 10 p.m., Cody reached his designated fuel stop near Fort Stockton. The truck stop was busy despite the late hour, with dozens of 18-wheelers parked in organized rows and a constant flow of traffic through the fuel islands. It was the kind of place where Cody normally felt comfortable, surrounded by other professional drivers. But tonight, every face seemed potentially hostile. Following his instructions, Cody pulled up to fuel island number 7 and began the process of refueling his truck. The black Suburban had disappeared from his mirrors, but he spotted it parked near the truck stop's restaurant, positioned to observe his activities. While his fuel tank filled, Cody walked into the building through the specified entrance. The interior was typical of truck stops throughout America: bright fluorescent lighting, aisles of snacks and trucking supplies, a restaurant area where drivers grabbed quick meals between runs. But tonight, Cody noticed details he normally would have ignored. A man in jeans and a cowboy hat was reading a newspaper near the coffee counter, but his eyes kept tracking Cody's movements. Another man, wearing the kind of work clothes that suggested he was a legitimate trucker, was having an animated conversation on his cell phone in Spanish. A woman behind the counter seemed to be paying more attention to Cody than to her other customers. Any or all of them could be cartel operatives, watching to make sure Cody followed protocol. Cody bought coffee and a sandwich, using cash as instructed, then returned to his truck. As he prepared to leave the fuel stop, his cell phone rang. The number wasn't one he recognized, but given the circumstances, he felt compelled to answer. "Jenkins." His voice sounded steadier than he felt. "How's the drive going?" The voice was Miguel's. "Fine. No problems." "Good. You should reach the next checkpoint around 1 a.m. Same protocols apply." The call ended before Cody could respond. He looked at his route instructions and saw that his next scheduled stop was at a truck stop near Junction, Texas. Another specific location, another time window, another opportunity for the cartel to verify that their delivery was proceeding as planned. Back on Interstate 10, the surveillance resumed immediately. The black Suburban reappeared in his mirrors, and Cody noticed that the white pickup truck was also back, maintaining its leapfrogging pattern. The level of security was both impressive and terrifying. As he drove through the hill country of central Texas, Cody began to understand the scope of the operation he'd become involved in. This wasn't some desperate scheme by local dealers. This was a sophisticated international trafficking network with resources, connections, and reach that probably extended into law enforcement, transportation companies, and government agencies. Miguel's comment about the route being cleared through security channels suggested that someone with access to law enforcement databases had ensured that Cody's truck wouldn't be subject to random inspections or roadside checks. The cartel had probably identified which highway patrol units were working that night, which way stations were operational, and which routes offered the least risk of interdiction. Around midnight, Cody's CB radio came alive with chatter about a major accident on I-10 eastbound near Kerrville. A multi-vehicle collision had closed both lanes, and traffic was being diverted to alternate routes. Under normal circumstances, Cody would have taken the detour and probably gained time by avoiding the backup. But his instructions were specific, no deviations from the prescribed route. If I-10 was closed, he was supposed to wait for it to reopen, regardless of delays. The black Suburban had moved closer to his position, probably anticipating that Cody might try to take an unauthorized detour. When traffic began backing up at the accident site, the Suburban positioned itself directly behind Cody's trailer, making it clear that any attempt to leave the highway would be blocked. For 3 hours, Cody sat in stopped traffic about 5 miles from the accident scene. During that time, he watched the cartel's security operation adapt to the changing circumstances. The white pickup truck had moved ahead to monitor the accident site, probably reporting on police activity and estimated clearance times. Several men on motorcycles appeared and disappeared, apparently serving as mobile communications relays between different elements of the security team. The sophistication was impressive, but it was also a reminder of what Cody was dealing with. These people had turned drug trafficking into a military operation, with contingency plans for every possible scenario. If they could coordinate a security operation around a random traffic accident, they could certainly handle one problematic truck driver. At 3:17 a.m., traffic began moving again. The accident site was a sobering reminder of highway mortality. Twisted metal, emergency vehicle lights, and the kind of devastation that could end lives in seconds. But as Cody drove past the wreckage, he realized that he was probably in more danger from the people protecting him than from any highway accident. His cell phone rang again as he cleared the accident scene. "Everything okay?" Miguel's voice. "Traffic accident caused a delay, but we're moving again." "I know. How much time did you lose?" The fact that Miguel knew about the delay suggested that the cartel had real-time monitoring capabilities that went beyond simple visual surveillance. They might have access to highway department traffic systems, police communications, or GPS tracking that Cody wasn't aware of. "About 3 hours. Adjust your schedule accordingly. The delivery window is still 6 a.m. That doesn't give me much margin for error." "Then don't make any errors." Miguel's tone carried an unmistakable threat. The cartel's timeline was non-negotiable, and Cody's personal safety was secondary to ensuring that 23,000 pounds of drugs reached Houston on schedule. By 4 a.m., Cody was making up time on the final stretch of I-10 toward Houston. The black Suburban had been replaced by different vehicles: a gray sedan, a blue pickup truck, a motorcycle with 2 riders. The surveillance team was rotating personnel, probably to avoid detection by law enforcement, but their presence was constant. As he approached the Houston metropolitan area, Cody realized that his problems were just beginning. Delivering the drugs would complete his contractual obligations, but it would also make him a witness to a major trafficking operation. The cartel might decide that eliminating that witness was safer than trusting his silence. The delivery address was in the Bayport Industrial Complex, a sprawling area of warehouses, chemical plants, and shipping facilities near the Houston Ship Channel. The area was busy around the clock with commercial traffic, making it an ideal location for discreet cargo transfers. Cody's instructions directed him to Warehouse 47C, a nondescript building that looked identical to dozens of others in the complex. As he turned into the facility's parking area, he saw that several other trucks were already there, along with numerous passenger vehicles and security personnel who made no attempt to conceal their weapons. The scale of the operation was breathtaking. This wasn't just one shipment arriving at one warehouse. This was a major distribution hub where multiple loads were being processed simultaneously. Miguel appeared at Cody's driver's side window as he backed up to the designated loading dock. "Right on time," Miguel said. "How was the drive?" "Eventful. That accident cost us 3 hours." "But you made up the time." "Good. Let's get you unloaded and on your way." As Cody watched the unloading process, he realized that Miguel's comment about getting him on his way might not mean what he hoped it meant. The warehouse personnel were moving with the same military precision he'd seen in El Paso, but their demeanor was different. More tense, more urgent, as if they were preparing for something beyond a routine cargo transfer. Standing in the early morning darkness outside Warehouse 47C, surrounded by armed men and millions of dollars worth of illegal drugs, Cody understood that he had passed the point of no return. Whatever happened next would determine whether he drove away from Houston as a free man or whether he became another casualty of America's drug war. The unloading was complete, but Cody's real test was just beginning. The unloading process at Warehouse 47C took 45 minutes, but to Cody, it felt like hours. Every crate that came off his trailer represented another link in a chain of evidence that could destroy his life if law enforcement ever connected him to this operation. He watched the proceedings from his cab, noting details that he wished he could forget. The warehouse crew worked with the same military precision he'd seen in El Paso, but here the operation was larger and more complex. Multiple trucks were being unloaded simultaneously, and the cargo was being sorted according to some system that Cody couldn't decipher. Some crates went to one section of the warehouse, others to different areas. Men with clipboards supervised each stage of the process, checking serial numbers and making notations that suggested sophisticated inventory control. What disturbed Cody most was the presence of what appeared to be legitimate businessmen among the obvious criminals. Men in expensive suits carrying briefcases, talking on cell phones, reviewing paperwork with the kind of casual professionalism that belonged in corporate boardrooms rather than drug warehouses. The cartel wasn't just a criminal organization. It was a business enterprise with the resources and connections of a multinational corporation. When the last crate came off his trailer, Miguel approached Cody's truck with an envelope similar to the one he'd been given in El Paso. "Your payment," Miguel said, handing over the envelope. $4,200 cash, as agreed. Cody took the envelope but didn't open it. "What now?" "Now you drive home. Same rules apply as before. No talking about what you've seen, no deviation from your prescribed route back to El Paso, no contact with anyone except your regular dispatcher." "And if I follow those rules?" Miguel's smile was cold and professional. "Then you go back to driving legitimate cargo and nobody bothers you." "What if I don't follow those rules?" "Then you become a problem that needs to be solved." The threat was delivered with the same casual tone Miguel might use to discuss weather conditions, but Cody understood that he was talking about execution. The cartel had invested too much money and taken too many risks to allow one trucker's conscience to compromise their operation. "There's something else," Miguel continued. "We were impressed with your performance on this run. Professional, punctual, no unnecessary questions. We have other shipments that require drivers with those qualities." Cody felt his stomach clench. "I'm not interested in regular work. The pay scale increases with experience. 5,000 for the next run, 7,000 for the one after that. A man could make a very comfortable living working for us." "And if he decided he didn't want that comfortable living anymore?" Miguel's expression didn't change, but his eyes took on a hardness that made Cody's skin crawl. "That would be unfortunate for everyone involved." The message was clear. Once you started working for the cartel, you didn't retire. You worked until they decided you were no longer useful, and then you disappeared. "I need to think about it," Cody said. "Of course, but don't think too long. Our next shipment leaves El Paso in 2 weeks,
and we'd prefer to work with drivers who have proven themselves reliable."
Miguel walked away without another word, leaving Cody alone with his truck and the knowledge that he'd crossed a line from which there might be no return. He started his engine and pulled out of Warehouse 47C, following the route instructions that would take him back to El Paso. As he drove through the Houston Industrial District, Cody noticed that the surveillance had resumed. Different vehicles this time. A red pickup truck, a black motorcycle, a white van, but the same pattern of coordinated observation. The cartel wasn't taking any chances with a driver who'd just witnessed a multi-million-dollar drug operation. On Interstate 10 westbound, Cody had time to think about his situation. He was carrying $4,200 in cash, payment for transporting illegal drugs across state lines. That money would solve his immediate financial problems, but it would also make him an accessory to federal crimes that carried decades in prison. More troubling was Miguel's offer of regular work. The cartel had identified him as a potentially valuable asset, which meant they'd probably conducted extensive background research on his driving record, financial situation, and personal life. They knew he needed money, and they were prepared to pay well for his services, but they were also prepared to eliminate him if he became a liability. Cody reached for his cell phone to call Sharon and report that he'd completed the delivery, but stopped before dialing. Every communication was probably being monitored, and any deviation from normal protocol might be interpreted as suspicious behavior. Instead, he used his CB radio to check in with other truckers on the highway. The normal chatter about road conditions and fuel prices was comforting. A reminder that most of the commercial traffic on America's highways was legitimate. But Cody now understood that criminal organizations were using the trucking industry as a transportation network for illegal cargo, and drivers like him were either willing participants or unwitting accomplices. Around 8 a.m., as he drove through the Texas Hill Country, Cody made a decision that would change everything. He pulled into a rest area near Junction and walked to a payphone that probably hadn't been used in years. He dialed the FBI's tip line from memory, a number he'd seen on wanted posters at truck stops across the country. "FBI, how can I help you?" "I want to report a drug trafficking operation," Cody said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Can you hold while I transfer you to the appropriate agent?" While he waited, Cody watched the parking lot for any sign that his surveillance team had followed him into the rest area. A few passenger cars, several trucks, but nothing that looked like the vehicles he'd been seeing in his mirrors. "This is Agent Lisa Martinez, Drug Enforcement Task Force. You wanted to report trafficking activity?" "I just delivered 23,000 pounds of drugs from El Paso to Houston. I have names, locations, vehicle descriptions, everything." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Sir, are you in a safe location?" "For now, but they're watching me. I think my phone is monitored." "What's your name and location?" Cody gave Agent Martinez the basic information, speaking as quickly as possible. "I need protection. These people kill anyone who cooperates with law enforcement." "We can help you, but I need you to stay calm and follow instructions exactly. Are you familiar with the witness protection protocols?" "I just want out of this situation." Agent Martinez's voice was professional but urgent. "Listen carefully. Continue your route as if nothing has changed. Don't deviate from whatever instructions you were given. We're going to put a surveillance team on you, but they'll maintain distance so your watchers don't know they're there." "How do I know you can protect me?" "Because we've been investigating this particular trafficking network for 2 years. You've just provided information that could help us shut down one of the largest drug operations in the Southwest." Cody felt a mixture of relief and terror. The FBI was taking his report seriously, but that also meant he was now caught between two powerful organizations that might both consider him expendable. What happens next? You go home, act normal, and wait for contact from one of our agents. Don't do anything that might make the cartel suspicious. If they offer you more work, accept it, but don't do anything illegal until we can coordinate a proper operation." "You want me to keep working for them?"
We want you to help us catch them, but that means staying in character until we can build a case that will hold up in court."
After ending the call, Cody returned to his truck with the knowledge that his life had just become exponentially more complicated. He was now an FBI informant in a drug trafficking case, which made him valuable to law enforcement but marked for death by the cartel if they discovered his cooperation. Back on Interstate 10, the surveillance resumed immediately. The same vehicles, the same patterns, the same professional oversight that had characterized the entire trip. But now, Cody knew that federal agents were also watching, invisible observers who were building their own picture of the cartel's operations. By afternoon, Cody was back in familiar territory, the desert landscape of West Texas that he'd been driving through for 12 years. But everything looked different now. Every truck stop might be a cartel safe house. Every other trucker might be carrying illegal cargo. Every law enforcement officer might be either an ally or a corrupted official who couldn't be trusted. As he approached El Paso, Cody's cell phone rang with a call from Sharon. "How did the delivery go?" she asked. "Fine. On time. No problems." "Good. The client was very pleased with your performance. They've already booked you for another run in 2 weeks." Cody's grip tightened on the phone. The cartel had moved quickly to ensure his continued participation, probably calculating that regular work would make him more invested in keeping their secrets. "What's the cargo this time?" "Same thing. Industrial equipment from El Paso to Houston. Same premium rate." "Sharon, do you know what we're really hauling for these people?" There was a long pause. "Cody, some questions are better left unasked. The money is good, the clients pay on time, and nobody gets hurt as long as everybody does their job." The implication was clear. Sharon knew or suspected that Aztec Logistics was a front for illegal activity, but she was willing to look the other way for the financial benefits. How many other dispatchers, trucking companies, and logistics operations were similarly compromised? "I need to think about it." "Don't think too long. They specifically requested you for the next run, and clients like this don't like to be kept waiting." That evening, back in his apartment in El Paso, Cody sat at his kitchen table counting the $4,200 bills Miguel had given him. It was more cash than he'd held at one time in years, enough to pay his truck payment, catch up on his rent, and still have money left over for luxuries he hadn't been able to afford in months. But it was also evidence of his participation in a federal crime, and keeping it would make him a co-conspirator in the cartel's operation. If he reported the money to the FBI, he'd probably have to surrender it as evidence. If he kept it and got caught, it would be used against him in court. Around midnight, there was a soft knock at his apartment door. Cody looked through the peephole and saw a woman in her 30s wearing casual clothes and carrying a badge case. "Mr. Jenkins, I'm Agent Martinez. We spoke this morning." Cody opened the door and let her in, noting that she immediately checked the apartment's windows and positioned herself where she could see both the entrance and the back door. "Are you all right?" she asked. "I'm scared as hell, but I'm alive." "That's a good start. We need to debrief you on everything you saw and heard during your trip, and we need to discuss your safety going forward." Agent Martinez set up a digital recorder on his kitchen table and spent the next 3 hours going through every detail of Cody's experience. Names, locations, vehicle descriptions, security procedures, personnel involved. She was particularly interested in the businessmen he'd seen at Warehouse 47C and the sophisticated inventory control systems the cartel was using. "This is bigger than we thought," she admitted after reviewing his statement. "We were tracking this as a regional trafficking operation, but what you're describing suggests an international distribution network with connections to legitimate businesses. What does that mean for me?" "It means you're extremely valuable as a witness, but it also means you're in serious danger. The cartel has killed people for much less than what you know." Agent Martinez explained that the FBI was prepared to offer Cody full protection and eventual placement in the Witness Protection Program. but they needed his continued cooperation to build a comprehensive case against the trafficking network. We want you to accept their offer of regular work, but this time you'll be carrying FBI surveillance equipment, and we'll have teams positioned along your route. Every pickup, every delivery, every contact with cartel personnel will be documented. How long will this go on? Until we have enough evidence to shut down the entire operation. Could be months, could be years. Cody looked at the stack of money on his table and realized that his problems were just beginning. He was now caught in a war between law enforcement and organized crime, and the outcome would determine whether he spent the rest of his life as a free man or as a casualty of America's ongoing battle against drug trafficking. Outside his apartment window, the lights of El Paso stretched toward the border with Mexico, where fortunes were made and lives were lost in the multi-billion-dollar drug trade that had turned the Southwest into a battlefield. And somewhere in that maze of legitimate and criminal enterprise, people were already planning the next shipment that would test Cody's courage, his survival instincts, and his ability to stay alive in a world where 18-wheelers carried death along with their cargo. 2 weeks later, Cody found himself back at the Aztec Logistics warehouse, but this time he wasn't alone. Hidden in various compartments of his truck were FBI surveillance devices that would document every aspect of the cartel's operation. A tracking device disguised as a standard GPS unit, cameras concealed in his mirrors and dashboard, and a sophisticated audio system that could pick up conversations from 30 feet away. Agent Martinez had spent hours briefing him on what to expect and how to behave. Act normal, follow orders, don't ask questions that might arouse suspicion. Most importantly, don't try to be a hero. The FBI's goal was to gather evidence and build a comprehensive case against the entire trafficking network, which meant Cody's job was to be a passive observer rather than an active investigator. But as he backed his trailer up to loading dock 3 for the second time, Cody realized that something fundamental had changed since his first pickup. The warehouse buzzed with an energy that felt dangerous and unpredictable. More security personnel, more weapons visible, more tension in the way people moved and spoke. Miguel greeted him with the same professional demeanor as before, but Cody noticed details he'd missed during his first visit. The way Miguel's eyes constantly scanned the warehouse, checking exits and monitoring personnel. The bulge under his jacket that suggested a concealed weapon. The subtle hand signals he used to communicate with other members of the crew. "Welcome back, Cody. Ready for another premium run? Same route as before? Same destination, different cargo. This load is more valuable, which means security will be tighter. You'll have more escorts this time, and the protocols are stricter." Miguel led Cody through the warehouse to observe the loading process, but what Cody saw made his blood run cold. Instead of wooden crates, this shipment consisted of metal containers that looked like oversized briefcases. Each container was being handled with extreme care by workers wearing protective gear that suggested hazardous materials. "What's in the containers?" Cody asked, trying to keep his voice casual. "Industrial chemicals," Miguel replied without missing a beat. "Very expensive, very dangerous if mishandled. That's why we're paying double for this run." Cody knew Miguel was lying. No legitimate chemical shipment would require the level of security he was witnessing. Armed guards positioned throughout the warehouse, sophisticated scanning equipment being used to verify container contents, and communication protocols that belonged in a military operation rather than a commercial facility. As he watched the loading process, Cody began to suspect that he was looking at something far more dangerous than drugs. The containers were too small and too heavily secured for bulk narcotics. The protective gear worn by the handlers was designed for substances that could cause serious harm through minimal exposure. And the security measures suggested cargo valuable enough to justify extreme measures to protect it. "How many containers?" Cody asked. 47. Total weight about 15,000 pounds. Much lighter than your last load, but infinitely more valuable.
Agent Martinez had briefed Cody on what to do if the cartel changed the nature of the cargo being transported. Document everything possible, but don't take any action that might compromise his safety or the FBI's investigation. Whatever was in those containers, law enforcement would analyze it after Cody delivered it to Houston. But as he watched the loading crew handle each container with the kind of care usually reserved for nuclear materials, Cody began to worry that he was transporting something that could cause widespread harm if it reached its destination. "Same security protocols as before?" he asked Miguel. "Enhanced protocols. You'll have 4 escort vehicles this time, and there will be checkpoints every 100 miles where you'll transfer to a different route. We can't afford any mistakes with this shipment." The enhanced security confirmed Cody's suspicions that this load was significantly more dangerous than the drugs he'd transported 2 weeks earlier. 4 escort vehicles suggested the cartel was expecting potential interdiction attempts, and multiple route changes would make it difficult for law enforcement to track the shipment. Miguel handed Cody a new manila envelope, this one sealed with wax that would show evidence of tampering. "Your route instructions and emergency protocols. Don't open this until you're on the highway, and destroy it immediately after reading. If you're stopped by law enforcement for any reason, you know nothing about the cargo except what's on your manifest." Cody took the envelope, noting that it was heavier than the one he'd received for his first run. More detailed instructions, probably including contingencies for various scenarios that might arise during transport. What if there's an accident? These containers look like they could be dangerous if they're damaged. Miguel's expression hardened. "There won't be an accident. You're going to drive carefully, follow your route exactly, and deliver this cargo undamaged. Failure is not an option." The implied threat was clear. Any mistake that resulted in damage to the cargo would probably result in Cody's death, regardless of whether it was accidental or intentional. As Cody prepared to leave the warehouse, he noticed that the escort vehicles were already in position. 2 black Suburbans, a white pickup truck, and a motorcycle with 2 riders. Professional security that looked more like a military convoy than criminal enterprise. But there was something else. As he walked back to his truck, Cody spotted what appeared to be federal agents conducting surveillance from various positions around the industrial district. A panel van parked across the street, 2 men in coveralls working on utility lines, a woman walking a dog who seemed more interested in the warehouse than in her pet. The FBI was positioning assets for whatever was about to happen, but Cody realized that law enforcement might not fully understand what they were dealing with. If the cargo was as dangerous as it appeared, any confrontation between federal agents and cartel security could result in a disaster that extended far beyond the immediate participants. Once he was back on Interstate 10 eastbound, Cody opened Miguel's envelope and read the route instructions. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. Instead of taking the direct route to Houston, he was being directed through a series of back roads and rural highways that would take him through sparsely populated areas. The route was designed to minimize civilian casualties if something went wrong with the cargo. But it was also designed to make federal surveillance and interdiction much more difficult. The FBI's carefully planned operation was probably based on the assumption that Cody would follow the same route as his previous trip. Instead, the cartel was using roads that would take him through areas where law enforcement had minimal presence. Cody reached for his CB radio to try to signal the federal agents who were supposed to be monitoring his progress, but stopped when he realized that any deviation from normal communication protocols might be detected by the cartel's security team. Instead, he focused on driving and tried to process the implications of what he was transporting. If the containers held chemical weapons, biological agents, or radiological materials, delivering them to Houston could result in thousands of deaths. But if he tried to stop the delivery, the cartel would kill him and find another driver to complete the shipment. For the first 100 miles, the escort vehicles maintained their positions around his truck, creating a security perimeter that moved with military precision. The black Suburbans took point and rear guard positions, while the pickup truck and motorcycle provided flanking coverage.
Any law enforcement attempt to approach his truck would have to contend with armed resistance from multiple directions. At the first checkpoint, about 2 hours from El Paso, Cody was directed to pull into what appeared to be an abandoned truck stop. But as he entered the facility, he realized it was anything but abandoned. The building had been converted into a sophisticated command center, with communication equipment, computer monitors, and personnel who looked like ex-military contractors rather than typical criminals. Miguel was waiting for him, along with a man Cody hadn't seen before. Older, better dressed, with the kind of authority that suggested he was high in the cartel's hierarchy. "Mr. Jenkins," the older man said, extending his hand. "I'm Eduardo Vargas. I oversee transportation security for our organization." Cody shook hands with Vargas, noting the man's firm grip and direct eye contact. This was someone accustomed to command and control, probably a former military officer who'd been recruited by the cartel for his organizational skills. "Is there a problem with the shipment?" Cody asked. "No problems, just enhanced security. We've received intelligence suggesting that law enforcement may attempt interdiction of this cargo. I wanted to brief you personally on what to expect." Vargas led Cody to a table covered with maps and photographs. The images showed various locations along his route, including what appeared to be federal surveillance positions. "The FBI has been tracking our operations for months," Vargas explained. "They think they understand our methods, but they're about to learn that we're more sophisticated than they anticipated." "What does that mean for me?" "It means you're about to become the center of attention for multiple federal agencies, DEA, FBI, ATF, maybe even Homeland Security. They're going to try to stop you from reaching Houston." Vargas pointed to several locations on the map where red X's marked potential interdiction points. "If you're stopped by law enforcement, your instructions are simple. Cooperate fully, say nothing about the cargo beyond what's on your manifest, and wait for our legal team to secure your release. Under no circumstances should you provide information about our operations." "What if they search the trailer?" "They won't find anything that connects you to illegal activity. Your manifest shows industrial chemicals being transported under proper DOT permits. Even if they open the containers, they'll need sophisticated laboratory analysis to determine what they're really looking at." The implication that the cargo had been disguised as legitimate industrial chemicals was both reassuring and terrifying. It meant Cody had legal cover if he was stopped, but it also suggested that the true nature of the cargo was so dangerous that it required elaborate concealment. "How dangerous is this stuff?" Cody asked. Vargas studied him for a long moment. "Dangerous enough that we're paying you $10,000 for one night's work. Dangerous enough that we have a 40-man security team protecting this shipment. And dangerous enough that federal agents are willing to risk a confrontation with armed cartel personnel to prevent it from reaching its destination." $10,000. The amount was staggering, but it also confirmed that Cody was transporting something far more valuable and dangerous than drugs. No criminal organization would pay that kind of money for routine contraband. "What happens if I decide I don't want to complete this delivery?" Vargas's smile was cold and professional. "Mr. Jenkins, you signed a contract the moment you accepted this cargo. Breach of contract has severe penalties in our line of work." The threat was delivered with the same casual tone a businessman might use to discuss quarterly earnings, but Cody understood that he was talking about execution. The cartel had invested too much money and taken too many risks to allow one driver's conscience to compromise their operation. Back on the highway, Cody found himself at the center of what was beginning to feel like a military operation. The escort vehicles had been reinforced with additional security personnel, and he could see armed men in tactical gear positioned throughout each vehicle. Whatever was in those containers, the cartel was prepared to fight a war to ensure it reached Houston. But as he drove through the remote areas of central Texas, Cody began to notice signs that federal agents were also positioning for confrontation. Helicopters appeared and disappeared on the horizon. Unmarked vehicles shadowed the convoy from distant positions, and radio chatter suggested that law enforcement was coordinating a large-scale operation. Around midnight, Cody's worst fears were realized. As he crested a hill on a rural highway about 50 miles from Houston, he saw roadblocks ahead illuminated by floodlights that turned night into day. Federal agents in tactical gear, armored vehicles, and what appeared to be hazmat teams positioned behind protective barriers. The convoy slowed to a stop about a quarter mile from the roadblock, and Cody could see cartel security personnel exiting their vehicles with military-grade weapons. What had started as a cargo delivery was about to become a battlefield, and he was trapped in the middle with 15,000 pounds of unknown chemical agents that might kill everyone within miles if they were released. His CB radio crackled with Agent Martinez's voice. "Cody, if you can hear me, we need you to separate your truck from the escort vehicles and approach our position slowly. We have protective equipment ready, but we need to secure that cargo before anyone gets hurt." But before Cody could respond, Miguel's voice came through on a different frequency. "Jenkins, maintain position. Any attempt to cooperate with federal agents will result in immediate termination." Caught between armed federal agents and cartel security, transporting cargo that might be designed to kill thousands of people, Cody realized that his survival depended on making the right decision in the next few seconds. Whatever was in those containers had turned a routine drug delivery into a potential weapon of mass destruction scenario, and the outcome would determine not just his fate, but possibly the fate of everyone in Houston. The war between law enforcement and organized crime was about to be fought with Cody Jenkins and his deadly cargo at the center of the battlefield. And in the distance, the lights of America's fourth largest city glowed against the night sky, unaware that its survival might depend on the actions of a single truck driver who had stumbled into a nightmare beyond his worst fears. Tanner Boyd should have kept driving. Every instinct in his 18-year trucking career screamed that stopping at the abandoned rest area off Highway 50 in Nevada was a mistake, but exhaustion had a way of overriding good judgment. He'd been fighting to stay awake for the past 100 miles, his eyelids growing heavier with each passing mile marker, and federal regulations required him to rest before he became a danger to himself and other drivers. The rest area appeared in his headlights like a ghost from another era. What had once been a standard highway facility now looked forgotten by time and neglect. Cracked concrete, overgrown weeds pushing through the pavement, and buildings that seemed to sag under the weight of abandonment. But it was off the highway, it was flat, and it was legal for commercial vehicles. Sometimes that was all a driver could ask for. Tanner pulled his Freightliner into what had been the truck parking area, noting that someone had spray-painted "closed" across the entrance sign in faded red letters. But the gate was open, and nothing officially prohibited parking there overnight. State budget cuts had shuttered dozens of rest areas across Nevada over the past decade, leaving drivers with fewer options for legal rest stops along the loneliest highway in America. He set his air brakes and shut down the engine, then sat for a moment in the sudden silence that descended over the cab. The quiet was profound out here, the kind of deep stillness that city people never experienced. No traffic sounds, no industrial noise, no human activity of any kind. Just the vast emptiness of the Nevada desert stretching away in all directions under a canopy of stars that seemed close enough to touch. But as Tanner prepared to climb into his sleeper berth, something caught his attention in his side mirror. About 50 yards away, partially hidden behind the rest area's bathroom building, was a car. A blue sedan that looked like it had been there for quite some time, its surface dulled by desert dust and neglect. Tanner grabbed his flashlight and climbed down from his cab to investigate. The sedan was a late-model Honda Accord with California plates, but what disturbed him was its condition. The car wasn't just dusty, it looked abandoned. Windows slightly open, driver's door not quite closed, and a thick layer of sand that suggested it had been sitting there for weeks or months. He played his flashlight beam across the interior and saw personal belongings scattered on the seats. A woman's purse, reading glasses, a travel coffee mug, and what appeared to be maps or documents. The keys were still in the ignition. Tanner walked around the vehicle, looking for signs of what might have happened to its owner. No obvious damage, no evidence of an accident or foul play. The car had simply been abandoned in place, as if someone had parked it and walked away without taking any of their belongings. A chill that had nothing to do with the desert night air ran down Tanner's spine. In 18 years of trucking, he'd seen plenty of abandoned vehicles along America's highways, but they were usually the result of mechanical breakdowns, accidents, or criminal activity. This felt different. The Honda looked like it had been carefully parked rather than hastily abandoned. Tanner returned to his truck and used his CB radio to contact the Nevada Highway Patrol. "This is Big T in a gray Freightliner at the old rest area on Highway 50, mile marker 91. I've got what appears to be an abandoned vehicle here. California plates. Looks like it's been sitting for a while." After several attempts to raise the highway patrol, Tanner realized his CB was getting only static. He tried his cell phone, but the device showed no signal bars. Not unusual in this remote part of Nevada, where cell towers were separated by hundreds of miles of empty desert. He made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Instead of driving to the next town to report the abandoned car, Tanner decided to investigate the rest area more thoroughly. If someone had been stranded here, they might have left clues about what happened to them or where they went for help. The rest area's bathroom building was a typical concrete block structure with separate entrances for men and women. The doors were unlocked, which suggested the facility hadn't been properly secured when it was closed. Tanner's flashlight revealed restrooms that looked like they'd been abandoned mid-cleaning, with supplies still stocked and toilets that probably still functioned. But it was what he found in the women's restroom that made his blood run cold. On the floor near the sinks was a woman's shoe, a brown leather flat that looked expensive and well-maintained. It was sitting upright, as if someone had carefully placed it there rather than dropped it accidentally. Next to the shoe was a small puddle of water that hadn't evaporated despite the dry desert air. Tanner called out, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. "Hello? Anyone there? I found your car outside." Silence. But as he stood there listening, Tanner could swear he heard something. A faint sound that might have been breathing or wind moving through the building, or someone trying to be very quiet. He searched the rest of the building methodically, checking every stall, every corner, every place someone might hide or take shelter. Nothing. But in the utility closet, he found something that made his hands shake. A stack of missing person flyers, yellowed with age and moisture damage. Dozens of them, featuring photographs and descriptions of people who had vanished in Nevada over the past several years. Men, women, families, all last seen somewhere along the state's network of lonely highways. What disturbed Tanner most was how recent some of the flyers were. The most recent was dated less than 6 months ago. A photograph of a middle-aged woman named Sandra Walsh from Sacramento, who had disappeared while driving from California to Colorado. The description matched the belongings he'd seen in the abandoned Honda. But why were missing person flyers stored in an abandoned rest area? And why so many of them, spanning several years? Tanner stuffed several flyers into his jacket pocket and returned to the parking area. As he approached his truck, his flashlight beam swept across something that made him freeze in place. There were more cars. Behind the rest area building, hidden from view of the highway, was a collection of abandoned vehicles. A white pickup truck with Arizona plates, a red SUV from Utah, a green sedan from Oregon, and at least a dozen others in various states of decay. Some looked like they'd been there for years, their paint faded and tires flat. Others appeared more recent, still showing traces of their original colors under the desert dust. Each vehicle told the same story as Sandra Walsh's Honda. Personal belongings left behind, keys in ignitions, doors unlocked as if the owners had simply walked away. But where had they gone? And why had so many people abandoned their vehicles at this specific location? Tanner moved through the collection of cars like he was walking through a graveyard. Each vehicle represented someone who had stopped at this rest area and never left. Families on vacation, business travelers, people relocating to new states, all united by the fact that their journeys had ended in this forgotten corner of Nevada. In the pickup truck, he found camping gear and a cooler that still contained bottled water. The SUV held children's toys and a car seat that suggested a family had been traveling together. The green sedan contained business documents and what appeared to be someone's entire life packed into boxes, as if they'd been moving across country. But it was what Tanner found in a white van with Colorado plates that nearly made him run back to his truck in panic. The van's rear doors were open, and inside was what appeared to be a makeshift campsite. Sleeping bags, lanterns, food supplies, and a journal filled with handwritten entries. Tanner opened the journal and began reading by flashlight. Day 1. Car broke down at rest area. AA says they can't get here until tomorrow. Plenty of water and snacks, so we'll just camp out until help arrives. Day 3. Still no sign of tow truck. Tried walking to highway to flag down help, but somehow ended up back here. GPS isn't working. Cell phone has no signal. Day 7. Something's wrong with this place. We keep trying to leave, but every road leads back to the rest area. It's like we're trapped in some kind of loop. Day 12. Found other people hiding in the buildings. They've been here for weeks, months. They say no one ever leaves this place once they stop. The journal entries continued for over a month, becoming increasingly desperate and incoherent. The final entry was dated 6 weeks after the first and consisted of a single sentence written in shaky handwriting. They're coming for us tonight. Tanner dropped the journal and backed away from the van, his heart pounding. The implication was impossible but terrifying. According to these entries, people who stopped at the rest area became trapped there, unable to leave no matter how they tried. But that was insane. Rest areas were just concrete and asphalt. They didn't trap people. There had to be a rational explanation for what he was seeing. As he stood in the parking area surrounded by abandoned vehicles, Tanner tried to process what he'd discovered. At least 20 cars and trucks, representing dozens of missing people, all apparently abandoned at the same location. Missing person flyers dating back years. A journal describing impossible circumstances. Either he'd stumbled onto the scene of a mass abduction or murder, or something genuinely supernatural was happening at this rest area. Tanner walked back to his truck, intending to start the engine and drive away as fast as possible. But when he turned the key, nothing happened. The engine didn't turn over, didn't even attempt to start. All the electrical systems were dead. He tried again, pumping the accelerator and checking his gauges. Nothing. His Freightliner, which had been running perfectly when he'd parked it 30 minutes earlier, was now completely inoperative. Tanner climbed down from the cab and opened the hood, playing his flashlight across the engine compartment. Everything looked normal. Belts, hoses, connections, all exactly as they should be. But the truck was as dead as if someone had removed the battery. As he stood there trying to understand what had happened to his truck, Tanner became aware that he was no longer alone in the rest area. Soft footsteps on gravel, the whisper of clothing against concrete, hushed voices speaking too quietly to understand. He turned toward the sounds and saw them. People emerging from the shadows around the buildings, moving with the careful steps of those who had learned to be very quiet. Men, women, even what appeared to be children, all dressed in clothes that ranged from recently abandoned to years out of style. An elderly man approached Tanner, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Don't be afraid," the man said. "We're not going to hurt you. We're just like you, travelers who stopped here and couldn't leave." Tanner played his flashlight across the man's face and saw someone who might have been a business executive or retiree before circumstances had reduced him to hiding in abandoned buildings. "How many of you are there?" Tanner asked. 43, the man replied, "including 3 families with children. We've all been trapped here for different lengths of time. I've been here for 8 months. Some of the others have been here for years." "Trapped how? What's stopping you from walking away?" The elderly man gestured toward the highway, barely visible in the distance. "Try it. Walk toward the road and see what happens. But don't go too far, or you might end up like the ones who kept trying to escape." "What happened to them?" The man's expression grew sad and frightened. "They disappeared. Not all at once, but one by one. People who refuse to accept that this place doesn't let go of its visitors. They'd walk out toward the highway and never come back." Tanner looked at the collection of abandoned vehicles and realized that each one represented people who had probably tried to leave and failed. But if 43 people were still alive and hiding in the rest area, what had happened to all the others? The elderly man seemed to read his thoughts. "There are rules here," he said quietly. "Rules you learn if you want to survive. Don't try to leave after dark. Don't venture too far from the buildings alone. And never, ever ignore the sounds that come from beyond the fence at night." As if summoned by his words, a low howling sound echoed across the desert from somewhere beyond the rest area's perimeter. It was unlike anything Tanner had ever heard, neither human nor animal, but something that made every primitive survival instinct in his body scream warnings. The other survivors immediately began moving toward the buildings, their faces showing the kind of terror that came from experience rather than imagination. "Come with us," the elderly man urged. "The buildings are safe, but only if you stay inside until dawn." Tanner followed the group into the rest area's main building, a structure he'd assumed was locked and empty. Inside, he found a hidden community of stranded travelers who had created a survival network in the ruins of a government facility. Sleeping areas fashioned from salvaged materials, a community kitchen supplied with food and water from unknown sources, and a communication center where people took turns monitoring CB radios and cell phones that never seemed to receive signals. "Welcome to the rest area," said a woman who might have been a soccer mom before whatever had trapped her in this place. "Population 44, as of tonight." As Tanner sat in the makeshift community center surrounded by people who insisted they were trapped in an abandoned rest area by forces beyond their understanding, he realized that his simple overnight stop had become something far more complex and dangerous than he could have imagined. Outside the building, the howling sounds grew louder and closer, and Tanner began to understand that morning might be a very long time away. The howling stopped just before dawn, replaced by a silence so complete it seemed to press against Tanner's eardrums. He'd spent the night huddled in the makeshift community center with 43 other people who insisted they were trapped in an impossible situation, listening to sounds that his rational mind couldn't categorize or explain. Around him, the other survivors were beginning to stir from whatever rest they'd managed to find on salvaged mattresses and improvised bedding. Children emerged from sleeping areas fashioned behind hanging blankets, and adults moved through the space with the quiet efficiency of people who'd learned to conserve energy and avoid unnecessary noise. The elderly man who'd first approached Tanner introduced himself as Robert Chen, a retired insurance adjuster from Reno who'd been driving to visit his daughter in Colorado when his car had broken down at the rest area 8 months earlier. "Every morning starts the same way," Robert explained as he distributed bottled water and granola bars from a supply that seemed far too large for a community of stranded travelers. "We check the perimeter, assess any damage from the night before, and try to figure out if anyone else has joined us." "Where does the food come from?" Tanner asked. "That's one of the mysteries of this place. The supply closets never seem to empty completely, and sometimes we find fresh supplies that weren't there the day before. Water flows from the taps in the building. Electricity works intermittently, and the restroom facilities function even though this place was officially closed years ago. Robert led Tanner outside into the harsh morning light of the Nevada desert. In daylight, the rest area looked even more abandoned than it had the night before. Concrete structures bleached white by years of sun, metal fixtures rusted beyond repair, and vegetation that had given up trying to survive in the hostile environment. But it was what Tanner could see beyond the rest area's boundaries that truly unsettled him. The landscape stretched away in all directions, flat desert punctuated by distant mountains that seemed to shimmer and shift in ways that had nothing to do with heat distortion. The highway that had brought him here was visible, a ribbon of asphalt that should have connected this location to the rest of Nevada's transportation network. "Try walking toward the road," Robert suggested, "but don't go more than a few hundred yards, and turn back the moment things start feeling wrong." Tanner began walking across the desert toward Highway 50, noting that the ground under his feet felt normal and solid. The sun was warm on his back, the air smelled of sage and dust, and everything seemed perfectly ordinary for rural Nevada. But after walking for about 10 minutes, Tanner began to notice subtle wrongness in his surroundings. The mountains on the horizon seemed to be in different positions than they'd been when he started walking. The highway appeared to be curving away from him instead of coming closer. And when he looked back toward the rest area, the buildings seemed farther away than they should be based on the distance he'd traveled. He continued walking for another 5 minutes, then stopped when he realized that the highway ahead of him was empty. Not just empty of traffic, which wouldn't be unusual on this remote stretch of road, but empty of any signs that vehicles had ever used it. No tire marks, no oil stains, no roadkill, no litter. The asphalt looked like it had been laid yesterday and never driven on. Tanner turned around and began walking back toward the rest area, but what he saw made his stomach clench with fear. The buildings were exactly the same distance away as when he'd started his walk, despite the fact that he'd been moving steadily away from them for 15 minutes. He began jogging back toward the rest area, then running as panic set in. But no matter how fast he moved or how long he ran, the buildings maintained the same position relative to his location. It was as if he was running on a treadmill, expending energy but making no progress toward his destination. Finally, Tanner stopped running and simply stood still in the middle of the desert, breathing heavily and trying to understand what was happening to him. As he stood there, the rest area buildings slowly began moving closer, as if the landscape itself was drawing him back to his starting point. Within minutes, he was standing next to Robert Chen again, though he had no memory of covering the final distance between his stopping point and the rest area. "Now you understand," Robert said quietly. "This place doesn't let go of its visitors. You can try to leave, but you'll always end up back here." "That's impossible," Tanner insisted. "Rest areas are just concrete and asphalt. They don't trap people. I thought the same thing for the first month I was here. Kept trying to walk out, drive out, even attempted to dig a tunnel under the fence. Nothing works. This place exists according to rules that don't make sense in the normal world." Robert introduced Tanner to other members of the community, each with a similar story. Sarah Martinez, a nurse from Phoenix who'd been here for 2 years after her car had broken down during a family emergency. Frank Peterson, a construction worker from Denver who'd stopped for a quick rest and never left. Maria Santos, a grandmother traveling with 2 young grandchildren who'd been trapped here for 6 months. "How do you survive?" Tanner asked. "Food, water, medical care?" "The place provides what we need to stay alive," Sarah explained. "Not comfortable, but alive. Food appears in the storage areas, water flows from the taps, and minor injuries heal faster than they should. It's like this place wants to keep us here indefinitely. But why?" Sarah's expression grew troubled. "We've developed theories over the years. Some people think we're dead and this is some kind of purgatory. Others believe we've crossed into a parallel dimension where normal physics don't apply. A few insist that we're being kept here by some kind of intelligence that feeds on human presence. What do you think? I think we're trapped in a place where the normal rules of reality don't apply, and questioning why is less important than learning how to survive. Sarah led Tanner on a tour of the rest area's hidden infrastructure. Behind the main buildings, the survivors had created gardens using seeds and soil that had appeared mysteriously in the storage areas. They'd established workshops for maintaining their clothing and improvised tools. They'd even created a school area where the children continued their education using textbooks that had somehow materialized in the abandoned facility. The hardest part isn't the physical survival, Sarah continued. It's maintaining hope when every day is exactly like the one before. Some people give up and just wait to die. Others become obsessed with escape attempts that never succeed. The ones who survive are those who accept the situation and focus on building a life within these constraints. But it was Frank Peterson who showed Tanner the most disturbing aspect of their situation. Near the rest area's eastern boundary was a section of chain-link fence that had been reinforced with additional barriers and warning signs created by the survivors themselves. "Don't ever go beyond this fence," Frank warned, "especially not at night. What's out there? Things that hunt people who venture too far from the buildings. We've lost 17 people over the years to whatever lives beyond the fence. They go out there thinking they can find another way to escape, and they never come back." Frank pointed to a collection of personal belongings that had been arranged near the fence. Shoes, wallets, jewelry, and other items that had apparently been left behind by people who'd disappeared. "We find their belongings scattered around the perimeter, but never the people themselves. Sometimes we hear them calling for help after dark, but we've learned not to respond. Whatever's out there uses their voices to try to lure more victims." "What kind of things?" Frank's expression grew haunted. "We've never seen them clearly, but we've caught glimpses. They move wrong, like they don't understand how human bodies are supposed to work. They make sounds that might be attempts at human speech, but the words are all scrambled, and they're always hungry." As afternoon approached, Tanner joined the community's daily routine. Water collection from a well that shouldn't exist, food preparation using ingredients that appeared spontaneously, and maintenance work on structures that seemed to repair themselves when no one was looking. But it was during the community meeting that evening that Tanner learned the most disturbing truth about their situation. "Every few months, someone new arrives," Robert explained to the gathered survivors. "A traveler who stops for rest or because their vehicle breaks down. They always react the same way you did. Disbelief, escape attempts, gradual acceptance that they're trapped here." "But I've been counting the abandoned cars," Tanner said. "There are at least 50 vehicles out there, but only 44 people in this community." The group fell silent, and several people looked uncomfortable. "Not everyone who stops here joins the community," Maria Santos said finally. "Some people refuse to accept the situation. They keep trying to escape no matter how many times they fail. Eventually, they venture beyond the fence and don't come back." "And others?" Tanner pressed. "Others just disappear," Robert admitted. "One day they're here, participating in community activities and helping with daily tasks. The next day, their belongings are still in their sleeping area, but they're gone. We never find out what happened to them or where they went." Sarah pulled out a notebook and showed Tanner pages covered with names and dates. "We keep records of everyone who's been here. 237 people have stopped at this rest area over the past 5 years. 44 are still with us. The rest either left through the fence and disappeared or simply vanished from the community without explanation." "What do you think happens to them?" "We don't know," Sarah replied. "But whatever force keeps this place running seems to require a certain balance. Too many people and resources become scarce. Too few and the place starts to decay. It's like there's an optimal population that this place tries to maintain." As the sun set over the desert, Tanner helped the community prepare for another night of survival. Windows were covered with heavy blankets, doors were barricaded, and everyone gathered in the central area to wait for the sounds that would begin once darkness fell. "The first few nights are the hardest," Maria told him. "You'll hear things that will make you want to run outside and investigate. Voices calling your name, sounds like people in distress, even what sounds like rescue vehicles arriving. But it's all lies designed to get you to leave the safety of the buildings." Around 10 p.m., the sounds began. Low howling that seemed to come from multiple directions at once, followed by scratching and scraping noises that suggested something was moving around the building's exterior walls. Then came the voices. "Help us. Please, we're trapped out here. Is anyone inside? We can see your lights. My car broke down. I need to use a phone." The voices sounded completely human and genuinely distressed, but the survivors had learned to ignore them. Whatever was making those sounds understood human speech and psychology well enough to create convincing audio illusions, but the 44 people inside the building knew better than to respond. "Sometimes they use the voices of people who've disappeared," Frank whispered to Tanner. "Last month we heard Jerry Martinez calling for help outside. Jerry vanished 3 months ago, but his voice was perfect. Same accent, same speech patterns, even knew details about his family that only Jerry would know." The night sounds continued until dawn, a constant psychological assault designed to test the survivors' resolve and trick them into venturing outside. Tanner lay awake listening to voices that claimed to be rescue workers, law enforcement officers, and even family members who'd come looking for him. But as the first light of dawn began filtering through the covered windows, Tanner realized that his situation was even worse than he'd initially understood. He wasn't just trapped in an abandoned rest area by some unknown force. He was imprisoned in a place that actively worked to reduce its population through methods that were both subtle and terrifying. The question wasn't how to escape. The question was how to survive long enough to figure out what this place really was and why it collected travelers from America's loneliest highway. Outside the barricaded buildings, something that sounded like his dispatcher Sharon was calling his name and asking why he hadn't checked in with his delivery schedule. But Tanner had learned enough in one night to know better than to answer. By his 7th day at the rest area, Tanner had begun to understand the rhythm of survival that governed the community of trapped travelers. Wake before dawn. Secure the perimeter. Distribute resources that appeared mysteriously in storage areas, and prepare for another night of psychological warfare against forces that seemed designed to reduce their numbers through attrition. But it was on the 7th night that Tanner learned the most disturbing truth about their situation. He was helping Robert Chen inventory their food supplies when they heard something that made everyone in the community freeze with terror. A child's voice calling from somewhere beyond the fence. "Mommy, Daddy, where are you? I'm scared." Maria Santos immediately moved toward the barricaded entrance, her face showing the kind of anguish that only a parent could understand. "That's Elena," she whispered. "That's my granddaughter's voice." Robert and Frank Peterson physically restrained Maria before she could reach the door. "It's not Elena," Robert said firmly. "Elena is safe in the children's area. This is what they do. They use the voices of people we care about to try to get us outside." But Maria struggled against their grip, tears streaming down her face. "That's her voice. She must have gotten outside somehow. We have to help her." Sarah Martinez joined them, helping to calm Maria down while explaining what everyone in the community had learned through bitter experience. "Maria, you know the rules. The things beyond the fence can perfectly imitate human voices, even voices of people who are still alive and safe inside these buildings. They're trying to trick you into leaving the safety of the community." The child's voice continued calling for several more minutes, each plea more heartbreaking than the last. But gradually, the other survivors managed to convince Maria that responding to the voice would mean certain death, not rescue of her granddaughter. "How do they know Elena's voice?" Tanner asked after the sounds had finally stopped.
That's what makes this place so insidious, Sarah replied. Whatever intelligence runs this rest area has access to our memories, our relationships, our deepest fears and desires. It uses that information to create psychological weapons specifically designed to break down our resistance. But Elena is right here in the building. She's been asleep in the children's area all evening. Exactly. Which means the entities beyond the fence can replicate the voice of anyone, whether they're missing or still alive. They've used the voices of family members, friends, co-workers, even celebrities that people in the community have mentioned missing. Frank showed Tanner a journal where the community kept records of the psychological attacks they'd endured. Last month, they used President Biden's voice, claiming that federal rescue teams had arrived and we needed to come outside for evacuation. Before that, they used the voice of a country music singer that one of the disappeared survivors had mentioned liking. The attacks are getting more sophisticated as time goes on. The next morning brought a development that shattered Tanner's remaining hope that their situation might have a rational explanation. While helping with the daily perimeter check, he discovered something that made him question his own sanity. At the rest area's western boundary, scattered near the fence, were the personal belongings of someone who had disappeared from the community 3 days earlier. Jerry Martinez, a truck driver from Texas who'd been trapped at the rest area for 6 months, before deciding he couldn't accept his situation and venturing beyond the fence despite everyone's warnings. But among Jerry's belongings was something that shouldn't have been possible. A photograph of Tanner himself, standing next to his Freightliner in what appeared to be the rest area parking lot. The photograph was dated 2 days before Tanner had ever heard of this place. "Where did this come from?" Tanner asked Robert, showing him the photograph. Robert studied the image with growing concern. "I've never seen this before, and Jerry never mentioned having a photograph of you. But the timestamp suggests it was taken before you arrived here." "That's impossible. I'd never been to this rest area before last week." "Nothing here follows normal rules of causality," Robert replied. "Time doesn't behave the way it should. Past, present, and future seem to overlap in ways that don't make sense." Sarah joined them, examining the photograph with the kind of clinical detachment she'd developed during her 2 years of captivity. "We've found evidence before that this place exists outside normal time," she said. "People have discovered belongings from their own futures, photographs of events that hadn't happened yet, even messages they apparently wrote to themselves from different time periods." "What does that mean?" "It means that whatever force controls this place isn't bound by linear time. It can observe events that haven't happened yet and manipulate circumstances to ensure specific outcomes." The implications were terrifying. If the rest area existed outside normal time, then Tanner's arrival might have been orchestrated years before he'd made the decision to stop for rest. The photograph suggested that his capture had been planned and anticipated by whatever intelligence ran this facility, but there was more. As Tanner studied the photograph more closely, he noticed details that made his blood run cold. In the background, barely visible, were other vehicles that he recognized from on his 14th night at the rest area. Tanner made a decision that would either save the community or damn them all. He couldn't live with the knowledge that 43 innocent people were being kept alive only until some alien intelligence decided to harvest their consciousness. And he couldn't pretend that following survival protocols would somehow lead to eventual freedom. While the community slept in the main building, Tanner slipped out through a maintenance access that Sarah had shown him weeks earlier. The underground chambers were accessible through multiple entry points, and he needed to return to the monitoring room to understand more about the harvesting process and when it was scheduled to begin. The basement levels were different at night. The corridors seemed longer, the chambers more numerous, and the technology more active. Banks of processors hummed with activity. Screens displayed data streams that moved too fast for human comprehension, and mechanical sounds suggested that automated systems were working throughout the facility. In the monitoring chamber,
Tanner found screens showing real-time surveillance of other rest areas across the western United States. Dozens of them, all apparently serving the same function as the facility that held him captive. Each showed communities of trapped travelers, ranging from small groups of fewer than 10 people to larger populations that exceeded 100. But it was the scheduling display that made Tanner's blood run cold. According to the automated systems, the Nevada rest area was scheduled for full population processing in 72 hours. Every member of the community would be harvested simultaneously, their consciousness extracted and stored in the energy banks that powered the facility. Worse, the scheduling showed that Tanner's arrival had triggered the harvesting countdown. His capture had provided the facility with whatever component it needed to begin the final processing phase. As Tanner studied the displays, trying to understand the technology and find some weakness he could exploit, he became aware that he was no longer alone in the chamber. A figure stood in the shadows near the entrance, watching him with inhuman stillness. "You weren't supposed to find this place," the figure said, moving into the light with movements that were too fluid and precise for human physiology. The being appeared to be female, but her features were wrong in subtle ways that made Tanner's primitive survival instincts scream warnings. Too perfect proportions, eyes that reflected light like those of a nocturnal predator, and skin that seemed to absorb rather than reflect the ambient lighting. "What are you?" Tanner asked, surprising himself by speaking calmly despite the terror that was making his hands shake. "I am a curator," she replied. "My function is to maintain optimal population levels and prepare subjects for processing. You have disrupted established protocols by accessing restricted areas. The people upstairs think they're survival. They don't know they're just being stored until you decide to kill them." The curator's expression didn't change, but her head tilted slightly in what might have been curiosity or confusion. "Death is inaccurate terminology. Consciousness extraction preserves the essential components of human experience while eliminating biological inefficiencies. The processed individuals continue to exist in enhanced form." She gestured toward the storage units that contained swirling clouds of light. "These are your predecessors. They have been integrated into the facility's operational matrix, where they serve important functions in maintaining the network of collection points across your continent. You're turning people into batteries. We are preserving human consciousness in a more efficient and sustainable format. Your biological bodies are temporary vessels. The consciousness extraction process allows for indefinite preservation of your essential selves." The curator moved closer, and Tanner could see that her clothing and general appearance were constructed from materials and patterns that weren't quite right, like a perfect copy created by someone who understood human appearance but not human nature. "The harvesting begins in 72 hours, Tanner said. "What happens if I try to warn the others?" "Warning them would serve no productive purpose. The processing schedule is fixed and cannot be altered by human intervention. However, your knowledge of restricted information requires immediate resolution." Tanner realized that he was about to become the next person to disappear from the community, processed ahead of schedule because he'd learned too much about the facility's true purpose. But as the curator moved toward him with predatory grace, he noticed something that gave him a desperate idea. The monitoring screens showed surveillance feeds from dozens of rest areas, but they also showed the facility's power distribution network. The entire system was connected through what appeared to be a central processing core that coordinated activities across all collection points simultaneously. If he could disrupt that core, he might be able to shut down not just his own facility, but the entire network of rest areas that were capturing travelers across the western United States. "I want to make a deal," Tanner said quickly. The curator stopped moving toward him, her predatory stance shifting to something that might have been interest. "Humans do not possess anything of value to offer in negotiations. I know something about your network that could help you optimize the harvesting process.
Information that could increase your efficiency and reduce the risk of discovery by my government. It was a desperate bluff, but the curator seemed to consider his words. Explain. Tanner pointed to the surveillance screens showing other rest areas.
Your collection points are too visible. Government agencies are starting to investigate the pattern of disappearances along major highways. If they discover what you're doing, they'll bring military forces that could disrupt your entire operation. The curator moved to the monitoring displays and began accessing data streams that scrolled too rapidly for Tanner to follow. Government investigation activities are within acceptable parameters, she concluded after several minutes. Human law enforcement agencies lack the technological capability to threaten network operations. But they could shut down the highways you use to bring people here. They could reroute traffic, close rest areas, even set up checkpoints that would interfere with your subject acquisition process. This argument seemed to have more impact on the curator, who spent longer examining the data streams. Explain your proposal. Tanner moved closer to the central processing console, hoping to get within range of whatever controls might allow him to disrupt the system. Help me understand how your network operates, and I'll help you develop strategies for avoiding government detection. I know how human transportation systems work, how law enforcement thinks, how to make your collection process more subtle and sustainable. The curator studied him with those inhuman eyes, and Tanner could almost see her calculating whether his offer had any genuine value. Your consciousness will be extracted in 72 hours, regardless of any information you provide. What benefit do you expect to gain from this negotiation? Better treatment for the people upstairs. Let them live out natural lifespans instead of processing them prematurely. They're not going anywhere, so why not let them have a few more years of biological existence? It was another lie, but one that might buy him time to find the system's weaknesses. Acceptable, the curator decided. You will provide consultation on network optimization strategies. In exchange, the 43 individuals in the surface community will be maintained in biological form for an additional period before processing. The curator led Tanner to a different section of the chamber where the central processing core was housed. The technology was beyond anything he'd ever seen, a combination of organic and mechanical components that seemed to pulse with their own internal rhythms. This system coordinates activities across 147 collection facilities throughout your continent, the curator explained. Population processing, subject acquisition, resource distribution, and consciousness integration are managed through centralized algorithms. As the curator demonstrated the system's capabilities, Tanner began to understand the scope of the operation he was trapped in. Tens of thousands of people had been processed over the decades, their consciousness extracted and converted into energy that powered an infrastructure designed to capture even more victims. But he also began to see weaknesses in the system. The centralized control meant that disrupting the core facility could potentially shut down all collection points simultaneously. The organic components suggested biological vulnerabilities that might be exploited, and the real-time coordination meant that the entire network was vulnerable to cascading failures if the right systems were damaged. What happens to the consciousness after it's extracted? Tanner asked, trying to gather information while searching for accessible control interfaces. Processed consciousness is integrated into the facility's operational matrix, where it serves computational and maintenance functions. Your predecessors now help operate the systems that will process your community. So the people you've harvested are still aware? They know what happened to them? Awareness is preserved but optimized for operational efficiency. Emotional responses and individual desires are minimized to prevent interference with assigned functions. The curator was describing a fate worse than death. The processed individuals weren't just used as energy sources. They were conscious slaves forced to participate in the system that had destroyed their physical existence. As Tanner pretended to analyze the system's optimization potential, he memorized the locations of critical control interfaces and began planning his attack on the central processing core. He would have one chance to disrupt the facility before the curator realized his true intentions, and the success or failure of that attack would determine the fate of everyone trapped in rest areas across the continent. I need to return to the surface community to gather more information about human psychology and behavior patterns, Tanner told the curator. The optimization strategies will require detailed knowledge of how your subjects think and react to various stimuli. Acceptable. You will return here in 24 hours with your analysis. As Tanner made his way back through the underground chambers toward the surface levels, he knew that he was carrying the hopes and fears of thousands of captured travelers. The consciousness extraction process had been operating for decades, but it was vulnerable to disruption if he could summon the courage to attack systems that were far beyond his understanding. Tomorrow night, while 43 people slept in the buildings above, believing that following survival protocols would somehow keep them safe, Tanner would return to the depths of the rest area's impossible infrastructure and either shut down a network of alien horror or become another processed consciousness forced to serve his captors for eternity. Above him, the Nevada desert stretched away under a canopy of stars that had been watching over similar atrocities for longer than human civilization had existed. And somewhere in that vast emptiness, automated systems were already selecting the next group of travelers who would find themselves stopping at rest areas from which no one ever returned. The harvest was coming, but Tanner Boyd was no longer willing to be a passive victim waiting for processing. Tomorrow would determine whether human courage and desperation could triumph over technology and intelligence that had been perfecting their predatory systems for centuries. Outside the main building, the nightly sounds began right on schedule. But for the first time since arriving at the rest area, Tanner wasn't listening to the voices beyond the fence. He was planning the attack that would either free every captive consciousness in the network or add his own awareness to the systems that powered humanity's nightmare on America's loneliest highways.